The autumn wind scattered golden leaves across Whisper Valley as 5 rough-looking men rode toward the isolated farmhouse, their intentions as merciless as the approaching winter. They couldn't have known that the elderly widow tending her garden, her hands gnarled by apparent arthritis and her silver hair dancing in the breeze, was once known as Quicksilver Maggie Morgan, the most feared outlaw leader the Dakota Territory had ever seen, with more successful heists to her name than any criminal in the last 20 years. Their mistake would be their last. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The 5 horsemen approached slowly, their mounts' hooves crunching, through the carpet of fallen leaves that blanketed the narrow path leading to the farmhouse. Autumn had painted Whisper Valley in vibrant shades of amber and crimson, but the beauty of the season was lost on these men. Their eyes, cold and calculating, remained fixed on their destination, the modest 2-story home sitting alone against the backdrop of pine-covered hills. Leading the group was Jasper Thornton, a man whose reputation for cruelty had spread throughout 3 states. The jagged scar running from his right eye to the corner of his mouth twisted his face into a permanent sneer, the result of a prison fight that had earned him the nickname Snakebite. At 45, he'd spent more years behind bars than in freedom, and each stint had only hardened his resolve to take what he wanted, regardless of who stood in his way. Riding to his right was his younger brother, Wesley Thornton, whose boyish good looks masked a soul as black as midnight. His custom-tooled leather gun belt held 2 matching Schofield revolvers, weapons he maintained with obsessive precision and used with a casual disregard for human life. At 32, he had already killed 11 men in fair fights, though witnesses often claimed his opponents barely had time to reach for their weapons before Wesley's bullets found them. Behind the brothers rode their newest recruit, Patrick. Lucky Ryan, a young man with fiery red hair and a desperate need to prove himself. His nickname was ironic. Orphaned at 12, raised in a series of brutal foster homes, and now riding with outlaws before his 21st birthday, luck had never been on Patrick's side. Yet something in his quick hands and quicker eyes had caught Jasper's attention during a bar fight in Blackwater, earning him a place in the Thornton gang. Flanking the group were the Wallace twins, Elijah and Ezra, hulking men whose massive frames made their horses seem almost comically small. Beneath them, rarely speaking and never smiling, they served as the gang's enforcers, their reputation for breaking bones as effective at intimidating potential victims as Jasper's gun. To all appearances, the isolated farmhouse seemed an easy target, a solitary widow living alone, her nearest neighbors miles away, with the winter approaching and likely a store of food and supplies worth taking. The gang had spent the last month terrorizing smaller homesteads throughout the region, but the approaching winter and increasing patrols from the territorial marshals had pushed them into this remote valley. What appeared to be merely an opportunity for easy plunder had caught Jasper's eye for another reason entirely. Rumors in Blackwater of a widow who paid for her supplies with gold coins of a particular vintage, the same vintage as the legendary Vermilion Creek robbery of 1858. That long-ago heist had become almost mythical over the years, the most successful train robbery in history, with over $50,000 in gold disappearing without a trace, along with the notorious Quicksilver gang that had engineered it. Margaret Fletcher, as she was known to her few neighbors in Whisper Valley, stood in her garden, her bent figure working methodically among the last of the season's herbs and vegetables. Her faded dress and simple grey shawl gave her the appearance of any other frontier widow, the lines on her face and silver in her hair suggesting a hard life honestly lived. To any observer, she seemed to be nothing more than a woman in her 70s, determined to maintain her independence despite advancing age. What the approaching riders couldn't see was how those apparently arthritic hands had once been the quickest draw in the Dakota Territory. They didn't notice how her stooped posture masked the coiled readiness of a predator, or how her seemingly random movements in the garden had systematically placed her in a position to observe their approach while appearing oblivious to their presence. Most dangerously for them, they had no way of knowing that the walking stick leaning against the nearby fence post had been specially modified to conceal a Winchester rifle with a custom-shortened barrel. Inside the house, 21-year-old Emma Fletcher, no relation to Margaret despite the shared surname, watched the approaching riders through a gap in the curtains, her heart pounding but her hands steady as she reached for the loaded Colt on the side table. Unlike Margaret's neighbors, Emma knew parts of the older woman's true identity, pieces she had gathered during the 2 years she had lived with the widow after escaping an abusive marriage. She had seen the hidden compartments built into the walls and floors, had glimpsed the collection of newspaper clippings, yellowed with age, that Margaret kept locked in a small iron box. Most tellingly, she had witnessed the widow's transformation during the night 3 desperados had tried to break into the barn last winter. How the seemingly frail woman had moved with lightning speed and deadly precision, leaving 2 men dead, and the third running for his life before the echo of the first shot had faded. That night had changed everything between them. "There are things about me you need to know, girl," Margaret had said afterward, her voice carrying a steel edge Emma had never heard before. "Things that mean you should probably leave come morning." But Emma hadn't left, the daughter of a drunk who'd married her off at 16 to a man 30 years her senior. She recognized the look in Margaret's eyes, the look of someone who'd built a fortress of secrets to survive. Instead of running, she had simply asked the older woman to teach her how to shoot as well as she did. Now, as the riders approached the front gate, Emma moved silently through the house, taking up the position they had practiced, behind the heavy oak sideboard that had been subtly repositioned months ago to provide cover while allowing a clear line of fire to the front door. Margaret Fletcher continued her unhurried work in the garden, her gnarled fingers gathering the last of the season's rosemary and thyme. Anyone watching might have thought her deaf or oblivious to the approaching danger, but each subtle movement brought her closer to the walking stick that contained her Winchester. Her calm demeanor belied the calculations running through her mind, angles of fire, positions of cover, the likelihood of who would move where once the inevitable confrontation began. "Look at her, old as dirt and doesn't even hear us coming," Wesley Thornton said with a chuckle as they approached the gate. "This'll be easier than taking candy from a baby." Jasper's eyes narrowed as he studied the scene. Something about the homestead made him uneasy, though he couldn't quite place what. Unlike the other properties they'd hit, this one showed signs of careful maintenance. The fence posts were new, the wood split with precision. The windows, unusual for such a remote location, were made of thick, quality glass. Small details that suggested either unexpected prosperity or careful preparation. "Remember, we want information first," Jasper reminded his brother in a low voice. "If she's been spending those gold eagles from Vermilion Creek, there's more where they came from." "Afternoon, ma'am," he called out as they reached the gate, voicing his scarred face into what passed for a friendly expression. "Hate to trouble you, but my brothers and I have been riding hard. Might we trouble you for some water for our horses?" Margaret straightened slowly, one hand pressed against her lower back as if pained by the movement. When she turned to face them, her expression was that of a cautious but not unfriendly frontier woman, someone accustomed to the rare visitor, but wary of strangers in such an isolated country. "Of course, gentlemen," she replied, her voice carrying the slight quaver of age. "The pump's round back by the barn. Help yourselves." She gestured with a gnarled hand, the movement drawing their attention away from how her other hand now rested on the walking stick. "Mighty kind of you," Jasper said, swinging down from his saddle and handing the reins to Lucky. "Perhaps we could. Trouble you for a bit of food as well? Been a long ride from Blackwater, and we'd be happy to pay." The last word carried a subtle emphasis, his eyes watching carefully for her reaction. If Margaret recognized the name of the town or noted the implied question about payment, she gave no sign. Instead, she nodded toward the house. "I was just about to put on a pot of stew. Not much, but you're welcome to share it." As she turned toward the house, walking with the slow, careful gait of the elderly, Wesley and the Wallace twins exchanged knowing smirks. This would indeed be easy pickings. "Need a hand, ma'am?" Jasper offered, moving to her side with false solicitude. "Those steps look mighty steep for someone in your condition." Margaret's smile didn't reach her eyes. "That's kind, young man, but I manage well enough. Been climbing these steps for 20 years without help." Her apparent dismissal of his offer was deliberate, the first test to see how he would react. To the slightest defiance, Jasper's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but he maintained his facade of politeness. Inside, his suspicion deepened. 20 years, she'd said. That would put her arrival in Whisper Valley around 1858. The same year as the Vermilion Creek robbery. Coincidence, perhaps, but in Jasper's experience, coincidences often proved valuable, when properly investigated. As Margaret reached the porch, she called out, "Emma, dear, we have guests. Put on more coffee, would you?" The warning was clear to Emma, but meaningless to their visitors. 5 men, armed, not friendly. Inside, Emma moved silently from her position to the kitchen, where she made deliberate noise with the coffee pot, while keeping the loaded Colt tucked in the folds of her apron. Through the small kitchen window, she could see the Wallace twins leading the horses toward the barn, while Lucky remained by the gate, his young face betraying his nervousness despite his efforts to appear hardened. Years of living in fear with her abusive husband had taught Emma to read men's intentions in the smallest details, the set of their shoulders, the rhythm of their movements, the focus of their eyes. Everything about these visitors screamed danger. Margaret led Jasper and Wesley into the main room of the house, a simply furnished space dominated by a stone fireplace and solid wooden furniture that looked handcrafted but oddly heavy for such utilitarian pieces. What the men couldn't see was that each item had been carefully designed for a dual purpose, the high-backed rocking chair positioned to provide both comfort and cover from the windows, the heavy sideboard Emma had hidden behind constructed, with an iron plate sandwiched between layers of oak. "Please sit," Margaret gestured to the table. "The stew won't take but a moment to heat up." Wesley sauntered around the room, making a show of admiring the few decorations while his eyes catalogued potential valuables. His gaze lingered on a small painting of a mountain landscape, noting with interest the heavy iron lockbox, partially visible on the shelf beneath it. "Lived here long, Mrs.?" Jasper let the question hang, realizing the widow hadn't offered her name. "Fletcher. Margaret Fletcher," she supplied, settling into her rocking chair with apparent difficulty. "And yes, quite some time now. My husband Thomas brought me here after the war. God rest his soul, he passed on some 15 years back." Every word was carefully measured. The fictional Thomas, the timeline that placed her arrival well after, the Vermilion Creek robbery, the suggestion of a long, uneventful widowhood. "Fletcher," Jasper repeated, testing the name. "Can't say I've heard of any Fletchers in these parts. Where'd you folks come from originally?" Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Margaret's weathered face revealed nothing as she replied, "Ohio, originally. Thomas was looking for open country after Gettysburg. Never did I like being crowded." She turned her attention to Emma as the young woman entered with a tray of coffee cups. "Thank you, dear. These gentlemen were just telling me they've ridden from Blackwater." Emma's hands remained steady as she poured the coffee, though her eyes never quite met those of either Thornton brother. Her apparent timidity was as much a performance as Margaret's frailty, a carefully cultivated persona designed to make men underestimate her. "Your daughter?" Wesley asked, his gaze lingering inappropriately on Emma. "My ward," Margaret corrected. "Emma lost her parents some years back. She helps me maintain the place." The explanation was simple, believable, and entirely false. Outside, the Wallace twins had reached the barn, their massive forms disappearing inside with the horses. What they would find there was the first of many surprises Margaret had prepared for unwelcome visitors. A barn that appeared ordinary from the outside, but contained subtle modifications that would immediately strike anyone familiar with Outlaws. Methods. The stalls were positioned to prevent a clear line of sight from any entrance. The hayloft ladder was reinforced to hold far more weight than farm work would require. Most tellingly, the back wall contained a hidden door that appeared to lead to a root cellar, but actually connected to a tunnel running back to the house. Back in the main room, Jasper Thornton's patience was wearing thin. While not the most intelligent of men, he possessed the predator's instinct for recognizing when a potential victim wasn't as vulnerable as they appeared. Something about this widow and her quiet ward had set off warnings in his mind. "Mrs. Fletcher," he began, setting down his untouched coffee cup, "I'll be direct with you. Times are hard, and we're looking for opportunities. We've heard stories of a widow in these parts who seems unusually comfortable, despite the isolation. One who sometimes pays with gold coins of an interesting vintage." The air in the room seemed to thicken with tension. Margaret's rocking chair creaked quietly. As she maintained her steady rhythm, her aged face revealing nothing. "Is that so?" she replied mildly. "Interesting what rumors will spread. I'm afraid you'll find nothing but modest comfort here, just what my husband's pension provides." Wesley, less patient than his brother, moved suddenly to the shelf and picked up the iron lockbox. "Then you won't mind if we have a look at what's so important it needs this kind of protection?" Margaret's rocking stopped. The abrupt silence seemed to fill the room like a physical presence. "Young man," she said, her voice still carrying the quaver of age, but now underlaid with something harder. "I suggest you put that down. My husband's war mementos have no value to anyone but me." Wesley's laugh was ugly as he shook the box, hearing the contents rattle. "Sounds like valuable mementos to me, old woman. Jasper, she's got something worth hiding." Outside, a single gunshot echoed from the direction of the barn, followed quickly by a second. Lucky Ryan's head snapped toward the sound, his hand dropping instinctively to his revolver. Inside the house, no one moved for a long, stretched moment. Then Margaret Fletcher smiled, a smile that transformed her face from that of a kindly old widow into something altogether more dangerous. "I was hoping we could avoid this," she said, her voice suddenly clear and strong, all traces of quaver gone. "But men like you never could take a hint." Jasper's hand flashed toward his gun, but before he could clear leather, Margaret moved with a speed that seemed impossible for her apparent age. The walking stick in her hand came up and twisted, the concealed mechanism releasing the Winchester rifle hidden within. By the time Jasper's revolver was halfway drawn, he was looking down the barrel of Margaret's weapon. Wesley, momentarily frozen by the transformation he was witnessing, recovered quickly and started to swing the lockbox toward Emma, intending to use it as a weapon. The young woman, however, was no longer where she had been standing. In the instant of distraction provided by the gunshots from the barn, she had moved to the position they had practiced dozens of times, the Colt appearing in her hand as if by magic. "I wouldn't," she said quietly, her gun aimed steadily at Wesley's chest. "I'm a better shot than I look." Outside, Lucky Ryan was caught in a moment of indecision. torn between investigating the shots from the barn and whatever was happening inside the house. His hesitation proved costly. The front door of the house burst open, and he found himself staring at a tableau that made no sense. The elderly widow standing straight and tall, a Winchester rifle held with the easy confidence of long familiarity, while the young woman covered Wesley Thornton with a Colt she clearly knew how to use. "Drop it, boy," Margaret called to him, her voice carrying the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Whatever you're thinking, it's not worth dying for." Inside the house, Jasper Thornton's face had gone pale beneath his weathered tan. The transformation he was witnessing triggered a memory, an old wanted poster he'd seen in a Kansas City marshal's office years ago, showing a woman with piercing eyes and a confident smile, a woman the poster named as Margaret Quicksilver Morgan, leader of the most successful gang of bank and train robbers the territories had ever known. "Can't be," he whispered, his hand frozen halfway to his gun. "Quicksilver Maggie died in that shootout in Cheyenne. Everyone knows that." Margaret's smile widened, revealing teeth too perfect for a frontier widow. "Everyone knows a lot of things. Mr. Thornton doesn't make them true." "Quicksilver Maggie Morgan," Jasper Thornton breathed, the name emerging with a mixture of disbelief and growing dread. "The woman who stole 50,000 in gold from the Northern Pacific Railway and vanished without a trace." Margaret's Winchester remained rock steady, her transformation from stooped elderly widow to commanding presence complete. The years had lined her face and silvered her hair, but her eyes now revealed the sharp intelligence and unwavering resolve that had once made her the most successful outlaw leader in the territory. "That was a lifetime ago," she replied, her voice carrying none of the quaver it had held minutes earlier. "I left that name behind in '64. Outside, Lucky Ryan remained, frozen, his inexperience showing in his inability to decide on a course of action. The silence from the barn following those two shots suggested the Wallace twins had encountered something unexpected and likely fatal. Inside, Wesley Thornton's survival instincts warred with his pride. The lockbox still clutched in his hands, he measured the distance to Emma, calculating whether he could use the heavy object as a weapon before she pulled the trigger. "I wouldn't," Emma advised calmly, reading his intentions. "Mrs. Fletcher taught me to shoot center mass. Very little chance of missing at this range." "Listen to the girl," Margaret added, her attention never wavering from Jasper. "She's a quick study. Reminds me of myself at that age." Jasper's mind raced through the stories he'd heard about Quicksilver Maggie's gang, how they'd pulled off a dozen major robberies without losing a single member, how they seemed to vanish like ghosts. After each job, how federal marshals and Pinkerton detectives had chased them across 5 states without ever getting close. The gang had been famous, not just for their success, but for their unusual composition. Maggie had recruited women as often as men, flouting every convention of the criminal world. "You're supposed to be dead," he said finally. "The papers all reported you died in that shootout with Pinkertons in Cheyenne." Margaret's smile held no warmth. "That's the story the Pinkertons preferred to tell, rather than admit they'd been outsmarted by a woman, again." To understand how Margaret Quicksilver Morgan had become the elderly widow of Whisper Valley, and how the Thornton gang had stumbled into a trap years in the making, we need to return to the Wyoming territory of 1864, long before the quiet farmhouse existed, when Maggie Morgan's name alone could clear a bank in seconds. Born Margaret Elizabeth Caldwell in 1830 to a prosperous Boston banker, young Maggie had received the sort of education rarely afforded to women of her era. Her father, lacking sons and possessing progressive ideas, had ensured his daughter understood not just literature and music, but mathematics, economics, and the intricacies of the banking system. What he couldn't have anticipated was how she would eventually apply this knowledge. When financial ruin struck the family in the panic of 1857, followed by her father's suicide, 27-year-old Maggie found herself alone and destitute, all family assets seized by creditors. With no marriage prospects and few respectable options for a woman of her background, she had headed west, determined to remake herself in a land where histories could be forgotten and reinvented. The turning point came in a small Nebraska town when she witnessed a bank robbery by the Notorious Bradley gang. What struck her wasn't their violence or intimidation tactics, but their inefficiency, the haphazard way they grabbed cash while missing the more valuable negotiable bonds, the time wasted threatening tellers who had no access to the main vault, and the lack of planning for their escape. Amateurs, she had muttered under her breath as she lay on the floor with the other customers. Unfortunately for her, she'd been overheard by Joseph Bradley himself, who dragged her outside and threw her on one of their spare horses as they fled town. Certain she faced assault and death, Maggie had instead found herself engaged in the most unlikely conversation of her life once they reached the gang's hideout. Bradley, intrigued by her comment, demanded she explain herself. Drawing on her banking knowledge, Maggie outlined precisely how the gang could have extracted 4 times the value with half the risk had they understood what they were actually looking for. Joseph Bradley, whatever his many flaws, recognized opportunity when it presented itself. Within 6 months, Maggie had risen from captive to advisor to partner. Within a year, after Bradley's death in a card game gone wrong, she had assumed leadership of the gang, transforming it from a brutal, opportunistic crew into the most methodical and successful criminal enterprise in the territories. Under her, leadership violence became a last resort rather than a standard practice. She recruited based on skill rather than intimidation. Former Army scouts who could plan escape routes, a telegraph operator who provided intelligence on shipments, a female theater performer whose talent for disguise and accents allowed her to gather information in places the men couldn't go. Most controversially, she insisted no women or children ever be harmed during their operations, a rule enforced with lethal consequences for any gang member who broke it. For 7 years, the newly christened Quicksilver Gang executed a string of robberies that baffled law enforcement. Unlike other gangs who spent their earnings conspicuously, Maggie insisted on modest living between jobs. She established legitimate businesses as fronts, invested portions of their takings, and created an intelligence network that often gave them information about law enforcement movements before the marshals themselves knew their next move. The Vermilion Greek job in 1858 had been their masterpiece, the careful targeting of a gold shipment based on information from their network. The precision of the execution and the complete absence of casualties had elevated the robbery from mere crime to frontier legend. The 50,000 in gold coins had disappeared so completely that some speculated it had never existed at all. But by 1864, the landscape was changing. The Civil War had brought increased federal presence to the territories, and the growing sophistication of law enforcement made their operations increasingly risky. The Pinkertons, in particular, had made capturing Quicksilver Maggie a matter of professional pride after she had embarrassed them on 3 separate occasions. The Cheyenne incident had been meant as her gang's final job. One last score before they scattered to the lives they had prepared for themselves with their accumulated wealth. Instead, they had ridden into a trap. Someone had betrayed them, though Maggie never discovered who. Half her gang died in the ensuing shootout, while Maggie herself had taken a bullet to the shoulder before escaping. The newspapers, fed information by Pinkerton agents eager to claim victory, reported Quicksilver Maggie among the dead. In reality, she had made her way to a predetermined fallback location where her most trusted lieutenant, Rebecca Allen, had helped treat her wound and establish her new identity as recently widowed Margaret Fletcher from Ohio. With papers furnished by one of the legitimate businesses she had established years earlier, Margaret Fletcher had slowly made her way to the remote Whisper Valley, where she used a portion of her hidden wealth to purchase the land that would become her sanctuary. There, she carefully constructed not just a home, but a fortress disguised as a humble farmhouse, prepared for the day when her past might find her again. Now, over 20 years later, as she faced Jasper Thornton across her, parlour Maggie found herself reflecting on the strange circularity of fate. She had chosen honest obscurity for her final years, yet violence had found her anyway, as it always seemed to do. The Vermilion Creek gold, Jasper said, his initial shock giving way to avarice. You still have it, don't you? After all these years. Margaret's expression revealed nothing. Mr. Thornton, whatever notions you have about ancient history, I suggest you focus on your current predicament. Your men in the barn haven't returned. Your youngest compatriot stands indecisive. With a gun, he's barely able to hold steady, and you and your brother face two women who will not hesitate to shoot if necessary. Wesley, never as calculating as his brother, made his decision. With a sudden movement, he hurled the lockbox toward Emma and reached for his Schofield. The young woman's reaction was instantaneous. She sidestepped the flying box while maintaining her aim, her finger squeezing the trigger with the practiced precision Margaret had drilled into her over countless sessions. The shot caught Wesley in the shoulder, spinning him back against the wall. His own shot went wild, splintering the ceiling beam overhead. The sound of gunfire galvanized Lucky Ryan into action. He drew his revolver and fired through the open doorway, the bullet embedding itself in the heavy oak door frame inches from Margaret's head. It would be his only shot. Margaret's Winchester spoke once, the bullet finding Lucky's gun arm with surgical precision. The young man cried out, his weapon falling to the porch boards. Jasper, unlike his impulsive brother, recognized the futility of drawing against someone whose reputation had been built on being faster than her opponents. Instead, he slowly raised his hands, palms outward. Seems we've reached an impasse, Mrs. Fletcher, he said, deliberately using her assumed name. Or, should I say, Miss Morgan? Margaret's smile was cold. No impasse, Mr. Thornton. Merely a conclusion. You haven't yet accepted. Outside, Emma called to the wounded Lucky Ryan, "Throw your gun away from you and get inside," slowly. Her voice carried the steel Margaret had worked to instill in her, authority without bravado, firmness without cruelty. Lucky, clutching his bleeding arm, looked toward the barn where his companions had disappeared, then back at the house where both Thornton brothers were now effectively captive. Self-preservation won out. He kicked his fallen revolver away and staggered through the door. "Sit there," Emma directed him toward a straight-back chair away from the brothers. "I'll tend that arm once we've settled matters." Wesley Thornton, his face contorted with pain and fury, clutched his wounded shoulder. "You'll regret this," he spat. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." Margaret's laugh held genuine amusement. "I believe that's my line, Mr. Thornton." She gestured with the Winchester toward the open door. "Emma, if you'd be so kind as to check on our visitors in the barn. I suspect they've already met Mr. Jensen." "Jensen?" Jasper's brow furrowed. "There's someone else here?" "In a manner of speaking," Margaret replied cryptically. Emma, keeping her Colt trained on the three men, backed toward the door. "Don't try anything foolish," she warned, before disappearing onto the porch. With Emma gone, Margaret adjusted her position slightly, ensuring she maintained a clear line of fire to all three men, while keeping herself partially protected by the heavy sideboard. The transformation in her bearing was remarkable. Gone completely was any hint of the frail widow, replaced by the poised vigilance of someone accustomed to controlling dangerous situations. "So," Jasper said, attempting to regain some psychological advantage, "the legendary Quicksilver Maggie spends her retirement playing house with a girl young enough to be her granddaughter. How domestic." Margaret didn't rise to the bait. Emma came to me 2 years ago, fleeing an abusive husband who'd purchased her from a father who valued whiskey more than his daughter's well-being. I gave her sanctuary and purpose. In return, she's given me companionship and assistance in my old age. Her eyes hardened. She's under my protection, Mr. Thornton. Remember that. The threat was unmistakable, despite its calm delivery. Outside, Emma moved cautiously toward the barn, her Colt held ready. Unlike her approach to the house, which had been silent and stealthy, she deliberately let her footsteps sound on the hard-packed earth. As she neared the barn door, she called out, "Mr. Jensen, it's Emma! The situation's under control at the house." A moment of silence followed, then a deep voice responded from within. "All clear in here too, Miss Emma. Our visitors have been accommodated." Emma entered the barn to find a scene that would have shocked anyone unfamiliar with the preparations Margaret had made years earlier. The Wallace twins lay unconscious, securely bound with hemp rope. Standing over them was a mountain of a man, Abel Jensen, the blacksmith from the settlement 20 miles away, who visited regularly under the guise of checking on the widow's property. In reality, Jensen was another remnant of Maggie's past. Ubrim, one of her few gang members who had survived Cheyenne. He had established himself as a legitimate blacksmith in the nearby settlement, his criminal past buried under years of honest work. But he had remained loyal to his former leader, serving as her eyes and ears in town and occasional backup when needed. "Walked right into it just like she said they would," Jensen observed with professional admiration. "Elijah here managed to get off a shot when the floor gave way, but it didn't hit anything important." He nudged one of the unconscious men with his boot. "Wouldn't have expected experienced outlaws to be so careless." The floor, he referred to, was Margaret's first line of defense in the barn, a carefully constructed false section that appeared solid but would collapse under the weight of a man, dropping intruders 6 feet into a pit below. The twins' size and weight had ensured they'd fallen through immediately upon stepping on the camouflage section. "They underestimated her," Emma replied simply. "Everyone does." Back in the house, Margaret kept her Winchester trained on the Thornton brothers. While addressing the wounded Lucky Ryan, "Young man, I suggest you reconsider your choice of associates. This path leads nowhere good." Lucky, pale from pain and shock, stared at the elderly woman who had shot him with such precision. Who are you really?" "Someone who made different choices than the ones you're making," Margaret replied, "and lived long enough to regret many of them." Jasper, his initial shock now replaced by calculation, studied Margaret with narrowed eyes. "The gold from Vermilion Creek," he said. "After all these years, it must still be hidden somewhere. No one ever found it." Margaret's expression remained impassive. "Is that what brought you to my door, chasing ghost stories about 20-year-old gold?" "Not just stories," Jasper insisted. "Gold eagles with the 1857 mint mark. A widow in these, part spending them occasionally in Blackwater. Too many coincidences, Maggie." For a moment, something like sadness flickered across Margaret's features. "The Vermilion Creek gold," she said softly. "So many lives lost over those coins. So many. Years spent looking over my shoulder." Before she could continue, Emma returned with Jensen following behind her, his massive frame filling the doorway. The blacksmith nodded respectfully to Margaret. "The twins are secured in the barn. Mrs. Fletcher, they'll have headaches when they wake, but no lasting damage." Margaret acknowledged him with a slight nod. "Thank you, Abel. I take it the tunnel entrance is still secure?" "As always," he confirmed. "No one would find it without knowing exactly where to look." Wesley Thornton, despite his wounded shoulder, couldn't contain himself. "Tunnel? There's a tunnel from the barn. That's how you've been moving the gold." Margaret exchanged a glance with Jensen that conveyed volumes without words. The shared understanding of people who had faced death together and kept each other's secrets for decades. "Mr. Thornton," she said finally, turning back to Jasper. "You came here hunting legends. Let me tell you the truth about Vermilion Creek, since it's likely to be the last story you ever hear." The crackling fire cast dancing shadows across Margaret's parlour as she settled deeper into her chair, the Winchester still balanced comfortably across her lap. Outside, the autumn wind had picked up, sending leaves skittering across the yard and rattling the shutters, nature's own accompaniment to the tale she was about to tell. "The Vermilion Creek job wasn't supposed to be a robbery at all," Margaret began, her voice taking on the cadence of a practiced storyteller. "It was meant to be a recovery." Jasper Thornton's eyebrows rose in surprise, while his brother Wesley continued to glower from his position on the floor, his wounded shoulder, now roughly bandaged by Emma. Young Lucky Ryan simply stared, caught between fear and fascination. In 1858, the banking system throughout the territories was chaotic at best, criminal at worst, Margaret continued. The California gold rush had created a need for currency that official channels couldn't satisfy. Private banks sprang up overnight, some legitimate, many not. Her eyes took on a distant look, as if seeing across the decades. "My father's bank in Boston had been destroyed by men who manipulated markets and called it business. I'd gone west with nothing but education and anger." Abel Jensen had taken up position by the door, his massive frame blocking any thought of escape. Emma maintained her vigilance from near the fireplace, her Colt never wavering. This was clearly a story she had never heard in full, and her expression showed equal interest. The Northern Pacific Railway had contracted with Hammond Banking to transport 50,000 in gold coins to establish a new regional bank in Helena, Margaret explained. What most people didn't know was that Hammond was laundering money for corrupt territorial officials, men who had squeezed honest ranchers and miners out of their claims through rigged courts and forged documents. Jasper's eyes narrowed. "You're claiming the Vermilion Creek job was some kind of righteous crusade? Robin Hood stealing from the rich?" Margaret's laugh held no humor. "There was nothing righteous about it, Mr. Thornton. I was hired to intercept that shipment by a consortium of businessmen who had lost everything to Hammond's schemes. They didn't care about justice. They wanted their money back, plus interest. I simply saw an opportunity to strike at the same kind of men who had destroyed my father." She shifted in her chair, her movements revealing none of the arthritis she had so convincingly portrayed earlier. "The plan was simple. Take the gold, return a portion to my employers, and keep the rest as payment. The execution was anything but simple. Hammond had hired Pinkerton guards. The train route included 3 military checkpoints, and the gold itself was secured in a specialized vault car." Abel Jensen smiled faintly at the memory. "Tell them about the water tower, Maggie." Margaret's eyes crinkled at the corners, the ghost of her younger self visible for just a moment. "We couldn't attack the train directly. Too many guards, too many variables. So we attacked the water tower at Copper Junction the night before, drained it completely, then contaminated what was left with a substance that would damage the locomotive's boiler. When the train stopped at Vermilion Creek for emergency repairs," Jensen continued, warming to the tale, "they had to detach the engine. The vault car was temporarily stranded with minimal guard presence while they waited for a replacement engine from the next station. That was our window." Margaret picked up the thread. 4 hours where the gold sat virtually unprotected, in the middle of nowhere. No shots fired, no lives threatened. The guards were drugged through their food, a concoction my mother had used as a sleep aid back in Boston. They awoke with nothing worse than headaches. Wesley spat onto the floor. "A bedtime story to make yourself feel better, old woman? Everyone knows the Quicksilver gang shot their way onto that train and left bodies behind." Margaret's eyes hardened. "History is written by whoever tells the loudest story, Mr. Thornton. The Pinkertons couldn't admit they'd been outsmarted by a woman and her crew without a single casualty. So they invented a bloodbath to justify their failure and massive expenditure hunting us. The newspapers always did love a violent tale better than a clever one, Jensen added. Maggie's rule was strict. No unnecessary violence, no women or children ever harmed. But the gold itself, Jasper pressed, unable to hide his avarice. 50,000 that simply vanished. After all these years. Yes, the gold, Margaret sighed. The part of the story everyone remembers while forgetting the men who stole it first through corrupt courts and rigged claims. She studied Jasper with the practiced eye of someone who had sized up countless adversaries. That's what led you here, isn't it? Some rumor about gold coins in Whisper Valley? Jasper nodded reluctantly. Blackwater Saloon, old-timer talking. About a widow who paid for supplies with gold eagles. 1857 mint mark, same as the Vermilion Creek shipment. Margaret exchanged a glance with Jensen, something passing between them that spoke of decades of shared secrets. Bill, she said quietly, perhaps it's time to show our guests what they came for. The blacksmith's expression registered surprise, then understanding. He moved to the heavy sideboard and pulled it aside with surprising ease, revealing a small dotter built into the floor, a door reinforced with iron bands and secured with a complex lock. "Emma, keep them covered," Margaret instructed as she rose from her chair with the fluid grace of someone half her age. She handed the Winchester to Jensen and knelt by the door, producing a key from a chain around her neck. The lock clicked, open with well-oiled precision. "Understand something, Mr. Thornton," Margaret said as she swung the door open to reveal a small ladder descending into darkness. "The Vermilion Creek gold has been both a blessing and curse. It funded a new life for those of us who survived Cheyenne, but it also meant a lifetime of looking over our shoulders." She descended the ladder with practiced ease, returning moments later with a small wooden box. Setting it on the table, she opened it to reveal rows of gleaming gold coins, their surfaces catching the firelight. 1857 eagles, Jasper breathed, his eyes wide with naked greed. "All these years, a small portion of what was taken," Margaret confirmed. "Insurance against hard times. The rest was distributed long ago, some to the original investors as promised, some to establish new lives for my crew, some invested in legitimate businesses that still operate today, including this farm," Jensen added. Margaret ran a finger over the coins, her expression thoughtful. "I keep these as a reminder of choices made and prices paid. They're also what allowed me to build this place. Not just a home, but a fortress I knew I might one day need." The room fell silent, except for the crackling of the fire and the wind outside. The tableau was frozen in time. 3 Outlaw. Prisoners, a legendary bandit queen now revealed, and her 2 loyal protectors. Jasper Thornton broke the silence. "So what happens now? You've caught us, shown us your secret. I doubt you're planning to let us ride away with well wishes and a story to tell." Margaret closed the box with a decisive snap. "That depends entirely on you, Mr. Thornton. Unlike some I've never killed without necessity. The Territorial Marshal's office is 2 days' ride," Jensen offered. "We could deliver them for the reward. The Thornton gang has a respectable bounty on their heads." Wesley snarled in response, wincing as the movement jarred his wounded shoulder. "They'll hang us for sure. The judge in Blackwater has been looking to make an example of someone." "Don't pretend you don't deserve the noose," Emma interjected, her voice hard. "Everyone in the territory knows what you did to the Peterson family last spring." A flicker of shame crossed Lucky Ryan's young face at the mention, suggesting he'd joined the gang after that particular atrocity. Margaret caught the expression and studied the young man more carefully. "You're new to this life, aren't you, boy?" she asked, her tone gentler than it had been with the Thornton brothers. Lucky nodded reluctantly. "Joined up 3 months back. Needed money. My ma's sick down in Texas." "And how's that working out for you?" Margaret inquired, gesturing to his wounded arm. "Found your fortune riding with these 2. The young man looked away, unable to meet her penetrating gaze. Margaret turned back to Jasper. I've spent 20 years in this valley living peacefully, Mr. Thornton. All I want is to continue that existence for whatever time I have left. So I'm offering you a choice. One more than you would have given me had our positions been reversed. She laid the options out with the clarity of someone accustomed to making life or death decisions. Option 1. We deliver you and your brother to the marshal in Clearwater. You'll likely hang, but it will be legal justice, not frontier vengeance, Wesley cursed, while Jasper maintained his calculating silence. Option 2, Margaret continued, involves a more permanent solution here and now. No one knows you came. To Whisper Valley, no one would miss you or come looking. The threat was delivered with a calm certainty that left no doubt she was capable of carrying it out. And the boy? Jensen asked, nodding toward Lucky. Margaret studied the young outlaw thoughtfully. He's young enough to make different choices. Whether he deserves that chance is another question. To fully understand the weight of the decision facing Margaret, we must return once more to her past, specifically to the aftermath of the Cheyenne disaster that had forced her to become Margaret Fletcher in the first place. The ambush had been meticulously planned by the Pinkertons. Someone in Maggie's carefully constructed network had betrayed them, though she never discovered who. Half her gang had died in the ensuing shootout, including Rebecca Allen, the former actress who had been both Maggie's lieutenant and closest friend. Wounded and alone, Maggie had fled into the wilderness, evading pursuit for 3 grueling days before reaching the abandoned hunter's cabin that served as one of their emergency rendezvous points. There she had found Abel Jensen and 2 other survivors waiting, all of them injured to varying degrees. For a week they had hidden, tending wounds and mourning their fallen comrades, while Pinkerton agents combed the area. It was Jensen who had brought back a newspaper from a nearby settlement, its front page triumphantly declaring, "Quicksilver Maggie slain in Pinkerton raid." The Pinkertons, it seemed, had misidentified Rebecca's body as Maggie's, an understandable mistake given the physical similarities between the women and the fact that Rebecca had been wearing Maggie's distinctive silver-trimmed vest when she fell. "It's a gift," Jensen had told her, pointing to the headline, "a chance to disappear for real, to become someone else." That night, huddled in the dim light of a single candle, Maggie had made the decision that would shape the rest of her life. Quicksilver Maggie Morgan would remain dead. In her place would emerge widow Margaret Fletcher, a respectable woman seeking a quiet life away from painful memories, using a portion of the Vermilion Creek gold that had been cached in various locations. Throughout the territories, she had established her new identity, purchased land in remote Whisper Valley, and built not just a home, but a sanctuary against both law enforcement and former associates who might come looking for their share. Surviving gang members had scattered, each with enough gold to start fresh. Only Jensen had maintained regular contact over the years, establishing himself as a blacksmith in a settlement far enough away to avoid suspicion, but close enough to provide assistance if needed. For 20 years, the deception had held. Whisper Valley's few residents knew Margaret Fletcher only as a private but pleasant widow who kept mostly to herself. The occasional gold coin spent in Blackwater had been a calculated risk, necessary to maintain her modest lifestyle without resorting to selling the land that provided her security. Now facing the Thornton gang in her parlor, Margaret was confronted with echoes of her own past. These men were what she and her gang might have become had she not maintained her strict code against unnecessary violence. They represented a road not taken, a reminder of how easily her quest for revenge against corrupt institutions could have devolved into indiscriminate brutality. "I'll give you tonight to consider your options," Margaret told Jasper, her decision made. "Dawn will be enough time for you to choose, and if we try to escape?" Jasper asked, his tone suggesting he was already calculating possibilities. Margaret's smile was cold. "This house has been prepared for unwelcome visitors for 20 years, Mr. Thornton. The doors are reinforced, the windows secured. There are other measures you wouldn't see until too late. She nodded to Jensen. Abel will stand watch. Any attempt to leave this room will be met with immediate consequences. With the matter settled for the moment, Margaret instructed Emma to fetch additional bandages and medicine for the wounded men. No sense in them suffering needlessly, she explained, though her vigilance never wavered. The Winchester returned to her hands as Jensen took up position by the door. As Emma left to gather medical supplies, Margaret fixed her attention on young Lucky Ryan. "You have a mother sick in Texas," she said, more a statement than a question. The young man nodded miserably. "Consumption. Doctor says she needs to go to a sanatorium in Colorado, but it costs more money than we'd see in 3 years of honest work." "So you decided theft and murder were acceptable alternatives," Margaret observed without judgment. "I understand desperation. Boy, I've known it intimately. But there are lines that once crossed, you can never uncross. Trust me on that." Lucky looked up, meeting her eyes for the first time. "Did you regret it? The robberies?" The question hung in the air, freighted with meaning beyond the simple words. Jensen, who had known Margaret longer than anyone alive, watched her face carefully. "I regretted the necessity," she answered finally. "I regretted the fear we caused innocent people caught in our operations. Most of all, I regret the friends who died because of choices I made." Her gaze moved to the small wooden box containing the gold coins. "But the men we stole from had stolen first, through laws and courts they controlled. I never lost sleep over their losses." When Emma returned with bandages and a bottle of medicinal whiskey, Margaret supervised as she tended to Wesley's shoulder wound and Lucky's arm. The older woman's knowledge of bullet wounds was extensive, another relic of her outlaw days that had proven useful in her retirement. "Clean through," she noted, examining Wesley's shoulder. "You'll keep the arm, though you'll feel it in damp weather." The clinical assessment held neither sympathy nor malice. Wesley's only response was a sullen glare, though he accepted the whiskey she offered, downing a generous measure before Emma began cleaning the wound. Night had fallen completely. Outside, the autumn wind carrying the first hint of winter's approach. Jensen built up the fire while maintaining his watchful position. The small parlour took on an almost surreal quality, captor and captives sharing the same space in an uneasy truce that would end with dawn's arrival. "Get some rest if you can," Margaret advised the Thornton brothers as Emma finished her ministrations. "Tomorrow will bring decisions that require clear heads." Jasper settled back against the wall, his eyes never leaving Margaret. "You know we can't let you live," he said quietly. "Not with what we know now. Quicksilver Maggie, alive all these years. That's worth more than gold to some." Margaret's response held the weariness of someone who had considered all angles long before her adversary. "Mr. Thornton, do you truly believe you're the first to discover my secret? Over 20 years others have come looking for ghosts and gold. None have left to tell you about it." The simple statement delivered without bravado silenced even Jasper. The fire popped and crackled in the gathering quiet, marking the passage of time as predator and prey contemplated their next moves in this deadly game. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying with it the promise of the first autumn storm. Margaret settled deeper into her chair, the Winchester balanced across her lap, prepared for the long night ahead. She had survived far worse than the Thornton gang in her time, and the house she had built contained more secrets than they could imagine. Secrets that would prove decisive when dawn finally broke over Whisper Valley. The grandfather clock in the corner struck midnight, its resonant chimes breaking the tense silence that had settled over Margaret's parlour. Outside, the autumn storm had arrived in earnest, wind howling around the eaves and rain lashing against the windows with increasing fury. The weather had effectively sealed them all inside until morning, nature providing an additional barrier against escape or rescue. Emma had taken the opportunity to rest, curled in a chair near the fireplace, but positioned to keep the three captives in view. Despite her apparent relaxation, her hand remained close to her Colt. Jensen continued his silent vigil by the door, his massive frame silhouetted against the lamplight. Margaret herself showed no signs of fatigue. 2 decades of peaceful living had not erased the habits formed during 7 years as the leader of the most hunted outlaw gang in the territories. She could go days with minimal sleep when necessary, a skill that had saved her life more than once. Jasper Thornton, similarly accustomed to the demands of his outlaw lifestyle, maintained his watchful presence against the far wall. His brother, Wesley, had finally succumbed to exhaustion and whiskey, his wounded shoulder bandaged and his breathing heavy with sleep. Young Lucky Ryan drifted between wakefulness and troubled dreams, his injured arm cradled against his chest. "You should have killed us outright," Jasper said softly, breaking the long silence. His voice was pitched low enough not to disturb the others. "Giving us until dawn. That's not the Quicksilver Maggie I heard about." Margaret's eyes, still sharp despite her years, studied him in the flickering firelight. "Perhaps you heard wrong," she replied. "Or perhaps 20 years changes a person." "Not that much," Jasper countered. "Not in our line of work." A faint smile touched Margaret's lips. "Our line of work. Mr. Thornton, whatever similarities you perceive between your gang and mine exist only in your imagination. We were thieves, yes, but there's a considerable difference between theft and wanton brutality." "Bullets all kill the same," Jasper shrugged. "Doesn't much matter what story you tell yourself afterward." "Is that what you tell yourself after raids like the one on the Peterson homestead?" Margaret asked, her voice hardening. "That there's no difference between your actions and a carefully planned bank robbery where no one gets hurt?" Jasper looked away, the first crack in his composed facade. "You've been out of the game too long, old woman. The territories have changed. There's no room for genteel outlaws anymore. And yet here I sit, 20 years later, with enough gold to live out my days in comfort," Margaret observed, "while you face hanging or a bullet, depending on tomorrow's choice." Perhaps there was wisdom in my methods, after all. The exchange lapsed into silence, both of them aware they represented different eras of frontier crime. Margaret's calculated precision giving way to Jasper's more brutal approach as law and civilization had pushed deeper into the territories. As the storm raged outside, Margaret found herself reflecting on the long, strange path that had led her from Boston banking scion to Notorious outlaw to this quiet valley. The choices made, the lives affected, the irrevocable turns that could never be undone. The most haunting of these was the Cottonwood Springs incident in 1862, a memory she had shared with no one, not even Jensen. The Quicksilver gang had been targeting a bank in the small Montana settlement, one owned by a particularly corrupt judge who had seized land from local farmers through fraudulent foreclosures. The operation had been meticulously planned, as always. What no one could have anticipated was the sudden arrival of a territorial marshal and his deputies, drawn to Cottonwood Springs, not by any knowledge of the impending robbery, but by the pursuit of a completely different fugitive. The resulting chaos had led to the only civilian casualty of Maggie's career, a young woman named Elizabeth Harper, caught in crossfire and struck by a bullet that could have come from either an outlaw's gun or a lawman's. In the confusion of their escape, Maggie never learned whose shot had been responsible, but the image of the woman crumpling to the boardwalk haunted her still. That night, hidden in their remote camp, Maggie had come closer to abandoning her outlaw life than at any point before Cheyenne. Only the conviction that their targets deserved to lose their ill-gotten wealth had kept her going. That, and The responsibility she felt toward her crew who depended on her leadership. What are you thinking about with that 1,000-yard stare? Jasper's voice pulled her back to the present. Margaret blinked, surprised she had allowed herself to become lost in memories with a dangerous man watching. Mistakes, she answered honestly, the kind that stays with you. Regrets, Jasper pressed, clearly trying to establish some connection that might give him leverage. A few, Margaret acknowledged, though perhaps not the ones you'd expect. A particularly violent gust of wind rattled the windows, causing Emma to stir slightly in her chair. Jensen shifted position, stretching muscles stiffened by hours of stillness, but his vigilance never wavered. The girl, Jasper nodded toward Emma. She's not just your helper, is she? You're training her, just like you were trained. Margaret's expression revealed nothing, though the observation was uncomfortably accurate. Miss Wilson's education is her own business, Mr. Thornton. Wilson? Jasper's eyebrows rose slightly. Thought her name was Fletcher, like yours. I never claimed she was family, Margaret replied evenly, though she silently cursed the slip. The long night was affecting her more than she'd realized. Jasper leaned forward slightly, sensing an advantage. So who is she really? Another stray you picked up, or something more specific? Margaret's patience thinned. Mr. Thornton, we've established that Dawn will bring decisions about your fate. How I choose to spend my retirement years is not relevant to that decision. Isn't it, though? Jasper countered. You're passing on skills, knowledge. The legendary Quicksilver Maggie prepares a successor. I'd say that's very relevant to someone in my position. Before Margaret could respond, Lucky Ryan shifted in his sleep, murmuring something unintelligible. The movement drew her attention momentarily, giving her time to consider her response carefully. You misunderstand my intentions, Mr. Thornton, she said finally. I teach Emma what she needs to survive in a world where men like you prey on those perceived as weak. That's very different from grooming a successor. Is it? Jasper's smile didn't reach his eyes. From where I'm sitting, you're creating another predator, just with different justifications. The observation struck uncomfortably close to concerns Margaret herself had wrestled with over the past 2 years. When Emma had first arrived at her door, bruised, terrified and desperate after fleeing her abusive husband, Margaret had offered sanctuary without hesitation. Teaching the young woman to defend herself had seemed natural, necessary even. But, as Emma had shown surprising aptitude for the skills Margaret taught, something more complex had evolved. Margaret recognized in the young woman the same fierce intelligence and determination she had possessed at that age, the same refusal to accept the limitations society placed on women, the same capacity for calculated risk. It had raised uncomfortable questions about whether Margaret was truly helping Emma or simply shaping her into a reflection of her younger self, questions that remained unresolved even now. You should rest while you can, Margaret said, deliberately changing the subject. Dawn will be here soon enough. Jasper recognized the deflection, but didn't press further. He had gathered useful information, confirmation that Emma was more than just a companion to the old woman, and possibly a leverage point should opportunity arise. As if sensing the direction of his thoughts, Jensen spoke from his position by the door. I'd advise against whatever you're planning in that head of yours, Thornton. I've known Maggie longer than anyone alive. She sees 3 moves ahead in any game. Jasper offered a thin smile. No offense intended to your lady friend Blacksmith. Just pass the time with conversation. The clock ticked on, as rain continued to lash against the windows. The fire had burned low, casting the room in deepening shadows that seemed to breathe with the wind's rhythm. In this liminal space between night and morning, the boundaries between past and present grew thin for Margaret, the young outlaw leader she had been, and the aged widow she had become seemed to exist simultaneously, each informing the other's decisions. Around 3 in the morning, a particularly violent thunderclap woke Wesley Thornton from his uneasy sleep. He jerked upright, wincing as the movement jarred his wounded shoulder, momentarily confused by his surroundings. "Easy, brother," Jasper cautioned. "We're still guests of Mrs. Fletcher." Wesley's eyes narrowed as he took in the scene, Emma now awake and alert in her chair, Jensen still at his post, Margaret watching him with the calm assessment of a chess player studying the board. "How's the shoulder?" Margaret asked, her tone neutral. "Like fire," Wesley admitted grudgingly, "but I'll live." "Yes," Margaret agreed, "for now at least." The implied threat hung in the air, reminding everyone that the night's uneasy truce would end with daybreak. Wesley studied the older woman with a mixture of hatred and reluctant respect. "You know," he said, "I grew up hearing stories about Quicksilver Maggie. My pa rode with the Halston gang for a spell, said they wouldn't go near any job if they heard your crew was working the same territory." Margaret's eyebrows rose slightly, the first genuine surprise she had shown. "The Halstons were before my time, mostly. Richard Halston was already in Yuma prison when I formed my gang." "Not his younger brother Thaddeus," Wesley corrected. "Thad rode until 63 or thereabouts. Pa said he respected you, claimed you'd elevated the profession, whatever that meant." Margaret's laugh held genuine amusement. "Elevated the profession. That sounds like Thaddeus. He always did have literary pretensions." Her eyes took on a faraway look. "We crossed paths once, in a hotel in Denver. Recognized each other immediately, though neither of us acknowledged it openly. We simply nodded and went our separate ways. Professional courtesy." "What happened to him?" Jensen asked, breaking his long silence. "I'd always wondered. Died in his bed in St. Louis," Margaret replied. "Or so I heard. Supposedly went legitimate, opened a shipping business with his ill-gotten gains. One of the few who managed to truly leave life behind. Like you," Emma observed quietly. Margaret's smile was tinged with irony. "Not quite like me, my dear. Thaddeus Halston truly became someone else. I simply hid in plain sight and hoped my past wouldn't find me." She glanced meaningfully at the Thornton brothers. "A hope that occasionally proves optimistic." The small moment of reminiscence faded as the practical realities of their situation reasserted themselves. Dawn was still hours away, but the decisions it would bring loomed large in everyone's mind. Lucky Ryan stirred and sat up, his young face haggard with pain and worry. Could I have some water, ma'am?" he asked hesitantly. Margaret nodded to Emma, who fetched a cup from the kitchen while maintaining a cautious distance from the prisoners. The small kindness seemed to embolden the young outlaw. "Mrs. Fletcher, Miss Morgan, whatever your name is," he began awkwardly. "I meant what I said about my mother. She really is sick, and I really did join up with them to get money for her treatment." "I believe you," Margaret replied, studying his earnest face. "But intentions don't erase actions, boy. What have you done since riding with the Thorntons?" Lucky looked down at his hands. "Mostly scouting and horses. Some robbery. I wasn't at Peterson Place. I'd only joined up the week after." "But you knew about it," Margaret pressed. "You knew what kind of men you were riding with." "I needed the money," he repeated, but the justification sounded hollow even to his own ears. "There's always a reason," Margaret said, not unkindly. "A justification that makes sense at the moment. I had mine too once, but reasons don't change the consequences." The conversation lapsed into silence, each person absorbed in their own thoughts as the storm continued its assault on the isolated farmhouse. The rain's intensity had begun to diminish, suggesting the worst had passed, though dawn remained hours away. Around 4 in the morning, Jensen approached Margaret and spoke quietly in her ear. She nodded and rose from her chair, stretching subtly, to ease muscles stiffened by hours of vigilance. "I need to check something," she announced to the room at large. Abel will remain here. Any attempt to take advantage of my absence would be ill-advised. To emphasize the point, Jensen produced a sawed-off shotgun from behind the door, a weapon that would be devastatingly effective at close range in the confined space of the parlor. Margaret moved with surprising agility for her apparent age, taking a small oil lamp and disappearing into the back of the house. The floorboards creaked faintly overhead as she ascended to the second floor. "Where's she going?" Lucky whispered to no one in particular. "Checking her defenses," Jasper guessed, "making sure we haven't disturbed anything during the night." Emma's expression remained neutral, though she knew the real purpose of Margaret's temporary departure. The older woman was checking the system of mirrors installed in the attic, a network that allowed her to observe the approaches to the farmhouse from all directions. The storm might have concealed additional threats, and Margaret would never allow herself to be caught unprepared. Upstairs, Margaret carefully adjusted the mirrors, scanning the surrounding landscape through specially designed openings in the roof. The rain had slackened to a steady drizzle, and in the faint pre-dawn light she could make out the approaches to her property. All appeared quiet, no sign of additional members of the Thornton gang or other potential threats. As she prepared to return downstairs, her gaze fell upon the small trunk tucked under the eaves, a container she had not opened in nearly 15 years. Acting on impulse, she set down her lamp and drew out the trunk, its brass fittings tarnished with age. Inside lay the few mementos she had allowed herself to keep from her previous life. A silver-handled derringer that had been a gift from Rebecca Allen, a folded wanted poster yellowed with age, showing a much younger version of herself, and most significantly, a small leather-bound journal. The journal had been her record during the active years of the Quicksilver Gang, not of their crimes, which would have been foolishly incriminating, but of her private thoughts and observations. It represented a connection to the woman she had been, a woman sometimes difficult to reconcile with the peaceful existence she had built in Whisper Valley. Margaret lingered over the journal briefly, then closed the trunk and returned it to its hiding place. The past could not be changed, only reckoned with. And now, with dawn approaching, she faced another reckoning, the decision of what to do with the Thornton gang. When she returned to the parlor, she found the situation unchanged. Jensen maintained his vigilant guard, Emma watched the prisoners with unwavering attention, and the Thornton brothers were engaged in whispered conversation while Lucky sat apart, lost in his own troubled thoughts. "Everything secure?" Jensen asked as she re-entered. Margaret nodded. "All quiet. The storm's passing." She glanced toward the window where the first faint lightening of the sky was barely visible. "Dawn's not far off." "And our decision?" Jasper asked, cutting directly to the heart of the matter. Margaret resumed her seat, the Winchester balanced across her lap. "That remains yours to make, Mr. Thornton. Surrender to proper authorities or alternatives." The euphemism hung in the air, its meaning clear to everyone present. "And if we choose neither," Wesley challenged, some of his earlier bravado returning. "If we take our chances right here, right now?" Margaret's expression remained impassive. "Then you'll join the others who discovered my secret and made similar miscalculations. Your choice, of course." The stark reality of their situation settled over the room like a physical weight. Margaret Fletcher, once Quicksilver Maggie Morgan, had survived to her advanced age not through luck, but through meticulous planning and a willingness to do whatever was necessary to protect her hard-won peace. The grandfather clock ticked steadily toward dawn, each second bringing them closer to the moment when choices would become actions, and the intertwined fates of everyone in the room would be decided once and for all. The first pale fingers of dawn crept through the windows of Margaret's parlor, painting the room in shades of grey and gold. The storm had passed during the night, leaving behind a washed-clean world of glistening leaves and rain-soaked earth. Inside, the tension had coalesced into something almost tangible as the moment of decision approached. "Time's up, Mr. Thornton," Margaret announced, breaking the silence that had settled over them for the past hour. "What's your choice?" Jasper exchanged a look with his brother, some unspoken communication passing between them. Wesley's face darkened, but he gave a barely perceptible nod. "We'll take our chances with the marshal," Jasper said finally. "Provided certain accommodations can be made for our journey." Margaret's eyebrows rose slightly. "Accommodations?" "Insurance," Jasper clarified. "The girl rides with us as far as Clearwater. Once we're safely delivered to the proper authorities, she returns here unharmed. Everyone gets what they want." "Except Emma becomes a hostage," Margaret observed, her voice hardening. "That's not a negotiation, Mr. Thornton. That's a threat." "Call it what you will," Jasper replied with a thin smile. "It's our condition." Emma, who had remained silent through the exchange, spoke up. "I'll do it." Margaret's head turned sharply. "No, absolutely not." "It makes sense," Emma insisted, meeting the older woman's gaze with surprising resolve. "They need assurance you won't simply execute them on the trail, and you need assurance they won't try anything desperate. I'm the logical solution." Jensen shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. "Maggie, the girl's right. It's risky, but less risky than the alternatives." Margaret studied Emma's face, seeing not fear but determination. In that moment, the parallels between the young woman and her younger self were startlingly clear. The same willingness to place herself in danger for a calculated advantage, the same cool assessment of risk versus reward. "You don't need to do this," Margaret said quietly. "I know," Emma replied with a faint smile, "but you've taught me well. I can handle myself around men like these." The exchange confirmed what Jasper had suspected during the night. Emma was indeed being groomed as more than just a companion. The realization brought little comfort, however, as it meant the young woman might prove less vulnerable than he'd hoped. Margaret rose from her chair, moving with the fluid grace that belied her apparent age. "Mr. Thornton, before we proceed, with this arrangement, I want to be abundantly clear about one thing." Her voice had taken on the commanding tone that had once directed the most successful outlaw gang in the territories. "If any harm comes to Emma, any harm at all, I will personally ensure that your deaths become the stuff of territorial legend. Do we understand each other?" The threat, delivered without theatrics or posturing, sent a chill through the room. Even Wesley, who had maintained his defiant attitude throughout their captivity, seemed to recognize the deadly seriousness behind Margaret's words. "Perfectly," Jasper replied, his own expression equally serious. "Business is business. No need for additional complications." Margaret turned to Jensen. "Abel, check on the Wallace twins in the barn. If they're conscious, bring them in. We'll need to prepare for the journey." As Jensen left to carry out her instructions, Margaret approached Emma and spoke in a voice too low for the others to hear. "This is unnecessary. There are other ways to handle them." Emma's response was equally quiet but firm. "You've spent 20 years hiding from your past. This is a chance to resolve it properly, through legitimate justice rather than frontier. Vengeance, isn't that worth something?" The observation struck deeper than Emma could know. Throughout her years as Quicksilver Maggie, Margaret had justified her actions through a personal code, targeting only those who had obtained their wealth through corruption, avoiding violence whenever possible, protecting the innocent. But in her heart, she had always known that her moral calculations were compromised, that her quest for justice had been inextricably tangled with her thirst for revenge against those who resembled the men who had destroyed her father. Here, in the autumn of her life, Emma was offering a different path, a chance to deliver genuine justice through legitimate channels rather than personal retribution. The irony that this moral clarity came from a young woman she had been training in the skills of her outlaw days was not lost on Margaret. Very well, she conceded finally. But you'll wear the special corset. Emma nodded, understanding immediately. What appeared to be a normal undergarment had been modified by Margaret to conceal a small derringer and blade, undetectable except through the most thorough search. It was one of many such adaptations Margaret had created during her outlaw years, designed specifically for female gang members who often escaped scrutiny due to prevailing assumptions about women's capabilities. Jensen returned, pushing the Wallace. Twins ahead of him. The massive brothers looked considerably less intimidating than they had upon arrival. Subdued by their night spent bound in the barn, their expressions a mixture of resentment and apprehension. "Found these two testing their ropes," Jensen reported. "Thought they might join our little journey planning." Margaret assessed the twins with a calculating eye. "I assume you heard the arrangement from your time in the barn." Elijah Wallace, distinguishable from his brother only by a small scar above his left eyebrow, nodded sullenly. "Girl rides with us to the marshal. No tricks, no ambushes." "Correct," Margaret confirmed, "and to ensure everyone's cooperation, I've made certain preparations." She nodded to Emma, who disappeared into the back room, returning moments later with a small wooden box. Opening it, Margaret revealed 5 small glass vials containing a pale blue liquid. "An insurance policy," she explained, selecting one vial and approaching Lucky Ryan. "Drink this." The young outlaw recoiled. "Poison?" Margaret's smile was cold. "Not immediately, no. This is a compound I learned to create during my time with certain indigenous peoples in the Montana Territory. It creates no symptoms for exactly 7 days. On the 8th day, without the antidote, the effects begin. First fever, then convulsions, then death within hours." "You're bluffing," Wesley spat, though his face had passed visibly. "Am I?" Margaret asked mildly. "You've heard the stories about Quicksilver, Maggie. Did any mention her time among the Blackfoot after a certain bank robbery went wrong in 61? How did she learn their healing arts and their poisons?" The room fell silent as the implication became clear. The story, whether true or fabricated, was entirely plausible given what was known about Quicksilver Maggie's legendary career. "All of you will drink," Margaret continued, her tone leaving no room for argument. "Emma carries the antidote, which she is instructed to administer only upon your safe delivery to the marshal in Clearwater. Any attempt to harm her or escape justice will ensure your painful deaths, regardless of whether you manage to elude immediate pursuit." The psychological effectiveness of the tactic was immediately apparent. Even if the outlaws doubted the poisons, reality, they couldn't afford to take the chance, not with their lives at stake. "That wasn't part of the deal," Jasper objected, his composure finally cracking. "The deal evolves," Margaret replied implacably. "Emma's safety is non-negotiable. This ensures it through means other than your questionable honor." One by one, reluctantly but left with little choice, the Thornton gang members consumed the liquid. Margaret watched with the satisfied expression of a chess player who has maneuvered her opponent into checkmate. What the outlaws couldn't know, and what Margaret had confided only to Emma, was that the vials contained nothing more dangerous than a bitter herbal concoction that would cause mild stomach discomfort but no lasting harm. The true power lay not in any actual poison, but in the fear it generated and the control it provided. This psychological manipulation was characteristic of Margaret's methods during her outlaw years. Unlike many gang leaders who relied solely on violence and intimidation, she had understood that perception often proved more effective than reality. The carefully cultivated legend of Quicksilver Maggie, her supposed supernatural speed with a gun, her uncanny ability to predict law enforcement movements, her knowledge of exotic poisons, had been deliberately fostered to magnify her actual capabilities. Now, in what might be her final performance as Quicksilver Maggie, she was employing the same tactics that had made her legendary. The Thornton gang, already destabilized by their unexpected capture, would remain compliant through fear of a non-existent poison, while Emma maintained actual control through more practical means. "We leave in 1 hour," Margaret announced, closing the wooden box with a decisive snap. "That gives us time to prepare the horses and supplies for the journey to Clearwater." As Jensen led the Wallace twins back to the barn to prepare the mounts, Emma helped Margaret gather provisions for the 2-day ride. The outlaws remained in the parlor under Margaret's watchful eye, each man absorbed in his own thoughts about the unexpected turn their raid had taken. Lucky Ryan, still nursing his wounded arm, finally broke the silence. "Ma'am," he began hesitantly, "what you said earlier about my choices, about consequences." Margaret studied the young man, noting the genuine distress in his expression. Unlike the Thornton brothers, whose hardened criminality was evident in every aspect of their bearing, Lucky still retained the uncertainty of someone new to the outlaw. Someone who might yet choose a different path. "What about it?" she asked, neither encouraging nor dismissing his attempt at conversation. Is there really no coming back once you cross certain lines?" The question emerged with painful sincerity, revealing the young man's struggle. With his recent choices, Margaret sighed, setting aside the provisions she had been packing. "That depends on what you mean by coming back," she replied, her tone softening slightly. "Can you undo what's been done? No. Can you choose differently going forward? Always." She measured her next words carefully, aware that they applied as much to her own life choices as to Lucky's. "The past shapes us but doesn't define us, not unless we let it. I've known men who committed terrible acts and later lived lives of genuine service and redemption. I've also known those who used their pasts as excuses to continue down dark paths." "And which were you?" Lucky asked, his youthful directness cutting to the heart of the matter. The question hung in the air, unexpectedly profound from such a young and inexperienced outlaw. Margaret found herself considering it with a seriousness she might not have afforded from someone older or more hardened. "I'm still deciding," she answered finally, with an honesty that surprised even her. 20 years of quiet farming hasn't erased 7 years of outlawry. Perhaps today's decision will clarify matters. Jasper, who had been listening to the exchange with calculating attention, interjected, "Don't waste your breath, boy. She's playing you, same as she's playing all of us." Quicksilver Maggie didn't get her reputation by rehabilitation and redemption. Margaret's gaze shifted to the older Thornton, her expression cooling. "You know remarkably little about how I got my reputation, Mr. Thornton. The stories told in saloons rarely capture the full truth of anyone's life." Before Jasper could respond, Jensen returned from the barn. "Horses are ready," he reported. 6 mounts, provisions secured. The Wallace boys are tied to their saddles. Figured we'd take no chances with those two." Margaret nodded approval. "Good. And the package for the marshal?" Jensen patted his vest pocket. "Sealed and ready. All the documentation he'll need." This exchange, meaningless to the outlaws, referred to materials Margaret had prepared years earlier in case her identity was ever discovered. A comprehensive account of the Quicksilver Gang's activities, including evidence of the corruption they had targeted and documentation of how the stolen funds had been used. While it wouldn't exonerate her legally, it would provide context that might influence how history remembered both her crimes and her 20 years of peaceful retirement. Emma returned from her room, now dressed for travel in practical riding clothes rather than her usual dress. The change in attire revealed a different young woman, confident, capable, and unmistakably dangerous in her own right. She wore a gun belt with practiced ease, the Colt positioned for a smooth draw. "Ready," she announced simply. Margaret surveyed. The group, her tactical mind assessing strengths, weaknesses, and potential complications for the journey ahead. The Thornton brothers, though wounded and restrained, remained dangerous, men with nothing to lose and reputations built on violence. The Wallace twins were physically formidable, but less cunning, followers rather than leaders. Young Lucky, with his injured arm and evident moral conflict, presented a different sort of variable, potentially an ally under the right circumstances. "Mr. Thornton," Margaret addressed Jasper, "before we depart, I want to be absolutely clear about the arrangements. Emma will ride with your group, but under Jensen's direct supervision. Any attempt to use her as leverage beyond the agreed terms will trigger immediate consequences. The poison you've consumed is merely the first of my precautions." Jasper's expression remained neutral, though his eyes narrowed slightly. "Understood. Business arrangements work best with clear terms." "Indeed," Margaret agreed coldly. "And to ensure those terms remain clear throughout our journey, there's one more detail to address." She reached into a drawer of the sideboard and removed a small leather case. Opening it revealed a syringe and small amber bottle, medical implements that seemed incongruous in the frontier farmhouse. "A mild sedative," Margaret explained, drawing a measured dose into the syringe. "Nothing dangerous, merely enough to ensure you remain cooperative during the initial stages of our journey." Wesley immediately began to protest, but Jensen's shotgun discouraged extended objections. One by one, with varying degrees of resistance, the outlaws received the injection. Within minutes, their movements became sluggish, their reactions dulled though they remained conscious. "An actual medical technique this time," Margaret noted with grim satisfaction. "Learned from a physician in Denver who owed me a favor. It will wear off gradually over the next 6 hours, enough time to establish the pattern of our journey without unnecessary complications." The sun had fully risen now, bathing Whisper Valley in the golden light of early autumn. As they prepared to leave the farmhouse, Margaret paused at the threshold, looking back at the home she had built and maintained for 20 years. Whether she would return to it remained uncertain, once her identity was confirmed by authorities. In Clearwater, her own legal status would become a pressing question. "Having second thoughts?" Jensen asked quietly, noting her hesitation. Margaret shook her head. "No, simply acknowledging an ending. One way or another, life changes after today." Outside, the horses stomped impatiently in the yard, their breath creating small clouds in the crisp morning air. The Wallace twins, already secured to their mounts, sat with the dull-eyed compliance induced by Margaret's sedative. Wesley and Jasper were similarly affected, though Jasper's eyes retained a calculating awareness despite the drug's influence. Only Lucky seemed largely himself, the lighter dosage Margaret had administered in consideration of his youth and injured state, leaving him groggy but coherent. As Jensen helped him mount, the young outlaw caught Margaret's eye. "Thank you," he said simply, though whether for the reduced sedative or their earlier conversation remained unclear. Margaret nodded acknowledgement, but offered no false reassurances about his future. The territorial justice system dealt harshly with outlaws, regardless of their age or level of participation. The best Lucky could hope for was a reduced sentence in consideration of his minor role and possible testimony against the others. Emma approached Margaret before mounting her own horse, her expression a mixture of determination and concern. "Are you certain about this? Once we reach Clearwater, there's no telling what might happen." "I've spent 20 years hiding from ghosts," Margaret replied, her voice steady despite the gravity of her decision. "Perhaps it's time to face them properly, whatever the consequence." The small cavalcade departed as the morning mist still clung to the valley floor, following the narrow trail that would eventually connect with the main road to Clearwater. Margaret rode at the front, her posture betraying none of the age or infirmity she had so convincingly portrayed for the Thornton gang. Jensen brought up the rear, his watchful presence ensuring no last-minute attempts at escape or resistance, as they created the ridge that marked the boundary of her property. Margaret paused, allowing herself one final look at the farmhouse below. The sanctuary she had built, the life she had constructed from the remnants of her outlaw past. Whether justice, mercy, or some combination of both awaited her in Clearwater remained to be seen. But as she turned her horse toward the distant town, Margaret Quicksilver Morgan felt something she hadn't experienced in decades. The peculiar lightness that comes from finally confronting long-avoided truths. The small procession wound its way through the forested hills surrounding Whisper Valley, following trails that seldom saw travelers. Margaret had deliberately chosen the less traveled route to Clearwater, avoiding the main road where they might encounter other riders. The fewer witnesses to their unusual party, the better. By midday, the effects of the sedative had begun to wear off. Jasper Thornton shook his head, as if clearing cobwebs, his eyes gradually regaining their calculating sharpness. His brother, Wesley, remained sullenly silent, though his movements in the saddle became more controlled, less puppet-like. The Wallace twins, riding ahead of them with their hands bound to their saddle horns, showed similar signs of returning awareness. "Water. Break," Margaret announced as they reached a small stream cutting through a meadow. 15 minutes, no more. Jensen helped the bound men dismount, keeping his shotgun within easy reach. Emma maintained her position slightly apart from the group, her hand never straying far from her holstered Colt. Her eyes constantly scanned their surroundings, applying the vigilance Margaret had drilled into her during countless lessons. "The sedative should be mostly cleared from your system by now," Margaret informed the Thornton brothers as she handed them a canteen. "I trust you'll remember our arrangement and the consequences of any ill-considered actions." Jasper took a long swallow before responding. "Hard to forget when you've supposedly poisoned us." His tone carried skepticism, though not enough to risk ignoring her warning entirely. "Supposedly?" Margaret's eyebrow rose. "Are you willing to gamble your life on that assumption, Mr. Thornton?" The question hung in the air unanswered. Whatever his private doubts, Jasper clearly wasn't prepared to test whether Margaret's poison was real or merely another manipulative tactic. Lucky Ryan sat apart from the others, cradling his wounded arm. The young outlaw had been unusually quiet since their departure, his expression suggesting an internal struggle far removed from their immediate circumstances. Margaret approached him, offering a small packet wrapped in waxed paper. "Willow bark," she explained. "Chew it slowly. It will help with the pain." Lucky accepted the offering with a nod of thanks. "How much further to Clearwater?" he asked, his voice low enough that the others couldn't hear. "We'll make camp tonight." "About halfway," Margaret replied. "Reach town by tomorrow afternoon if the weather holds." The young man nodded again, his eyes fixed on the distant hills. "What do you think will happen? To me, I mean." Margaret considered the question carefully. False reassurance would be cruel under the circumstances, but unmitigated pessimism seemed equally inappropriate for someone clearly wrestling with the path that had led him to this moment. "That depends partly on you," she said finally. "Your youth works in your favor. Your limited involvement in the gang's activities might as well, if you're willing to testify about what you know." She paused, gauging his reaction. "Your mother's illness could generate sympathy, though it won't excuse criminal acts." "So there's a chance," Lucky said, more statement than question. "A chance I don't end up swinging like the others." "There's always a chance," Margaret confirmed. "But it requires truth, cooperation, and genuine remorse, not just fear of consequences." This conversation about justice and redemption carried particular weight coming from Margaret herself. For 20 years she had evaded the legal consequences of her actions, building a life of quiet anonymity in Whisper Valley. Now, by escorting the Thornton gang to face territorial justice, she was potentially surrendering that carefully constructed sanctuary. Jensen approached, signaling that the break was ending. "Riders coming," he reported quietly. "Still distant, but headed this way on the main trail below." Margaret nodded, instantly alert. "How many?" 3, maybe 4, too far to identify. "We move now," she decided. "Take the high path through Miller's Ridge. It's longer, but keeps us hidden." Within minutes, they had remounted and were moving at a brisk pace toward the forested ridge that would conceal them from the approaching riders. Whether the distant travelers were innocent merchants or potential complications couldn't be determined, but Margaret had survived her outlaw years by avoiding unnecessary risks. The high path through Miller's Ridge proved challenging. The trail, narrowed in places to barely the width of a horse, with a steep drop to one side and dense forest to the other. Progress slowed as they navigated the difficult terrain, the horses picking their way carefully along the rocky path. "You know these trails well for someone who supposedly lived quietly in that valley for 20 years, Jasper observed, as they reached a particularly treacherous stretch. Margaret guided her mount with the easy confidence of someone intimately familiar with the landscape. A widow living alone learns to know all possible approaches to her property, Mr. Thornton, both to avoid unwelcome visitors and to escape if necessary. Always planning escape routes, Jasper mused. Old habits die hard, it seems. "They keep you alive," Margaret corrected. "Something you might have considered before riding into my valley." By late afternoon, they had cleared the ridge and descended into a sheltered valley that offered both water and concealment for their night camp. Jensen took charge of securing the prisoners, while Margaret and Emma set about establishing their campsite with practiced efficiency. "We'll take watches through the night," Margaret instructed as they worked. "You first, then me, then Abel." Emma nodded, though her expression suggested she had questions about the arrangement. Once they were momentarily alone, gathering firewood at the edge of the clearing, she voiced her concern. "3 watches? You're expecting trouble?" Margaret's smile held little humor. "I always expect trouble, my dear. It's why I'm still alive at my advanced age." "The riders Jensen spotted?" "Possibly." Margaret selected a fallen branch and tested its dryness. "More likely the Wallace twins' connection to Blackwater. They have friends there who might wonder about their absence." This insight revealed another aspect of Margaret's methodology, her constant awareness of social connections and potential threats. During her years leading the Quicksilver Gang, she had maintained detailed knowledge of rival gangs, law enforcement movements, and civilian populations throughout their territory. This intelligence network had contributed significantly to their unprecedented success rate and low casualty figures. Even in retirement, these habits had persisted. Margaret knew not just her immediate neighbors in Whisper Valley, but the extended connections of everyone within a day's ride. This knowledge had allowed her to identify potential threats long before they materialized, including, apparently, associations between the Wallace twins and other unsavory elements in Blackwater. As dusk approached, Jensen prepared a simple meal of beans, dried beef, and coffee. The prisoners were fed first, their hands temporarily freed, but kept under close watch during the meal. Conversation remained minimal, everyone conscious of the uneasy alliance that would end once they reached Clearwater. After the meal, with the prisoners secured for the night and Jensen taking first watch, Margaret approached Jasper Thornton. The outlaw leader sat propped against a tree trunk, his expression unreadable in the flickering firelight. "A word, Mr. Thornton," she said, settling beside him at a distance just beyond lunging reach. Jasper regarded her with cautious interest. More bedtime stories about Quicksilver Maggie's legendary exploits? Actually, a question, Margaret replied, ignoring his sarcasm. The Peterson family, why? The blunt inquiry caught Jasper off guard. His expression hardened as he realized the purpose of this private conversation. Business, he said flatly. Rancher wouldn't pay protection, made an example. By killing his wife and child as well, Margaret pressed, her voice level but with an undercurrent of steel. Was that business too? Jasper's jaw tightened. What's your interest in ancient history, Mrs. Fletcher? Trying to establish your moral superiority before turning us over? Trying to understand the difference between us, Margaret corrected. When I formed my gang, I established one absolute rule: no harm to women or children ever. That line was never crossed under my leadership. Different times, Jasper shrugged, though something in his expression suggested discomfort. Territories changed. Competition's fiercer. Examples need to be clearer. Margaret studied him in the dying light. Is that how you justify it to yourself? Progress and adaptation? I don't need to justify anything, Jasper snapped, his composure cracking slightly. Particularly not to a hypocrite who pretends her thieving was somehow noble because she had rules. The accusation hung between them, not without merit. Margaret's own moral calculations during her outlaw years had involved significant compromise. Theft remained theft, regardless of whether the victims were corrupt officials or innocent citizens. Perhaps you're right, she acknowledged after a moment, surprising Jasper with her candor. Perhaps the difference between us is merely a matter of degree rather than kind. But I believe lines exist, Mr. Thornton. Lines that once crossed transform us into something unrecognizable to ourselves. Jasper studied her with narrowed eyes. Is that what happened to you in Cheyenne? Crossed a line you couldn't uncross? The question struck uncomfortably close to a truth Margaret had confronted during many sleepless nights in the years since. The Cheyenne ambush had indeed marked a turning point, not just practically, in forcing her to assume a new identity, but morally as well. Something like that, she admitted, though perhaps not in the way you imagine. She rose to leave, but Jasper's voice stopped her. You know what happens when we reach Clearwater, he said, his tone conversational but loaded with implication. Marshall Thompson isn't known for his progressive views about female criminals. The legendary Quicksilver Maggie, alive after all these years, he'll want to make an example. Margaret turned back, her expression revealing nothing. Are you threatening me, Mr. Thornton, or expressing concern? Just making an observation, Jasper replied with a thin smile. Seems we're both riding toward justice we might prefer to avoid. Margaret held his gaze for a long moment. The difference, Mr. Thornton, is that I'm riding there by choice. With that, she returned to the fireside, where Emma sat cleaning her colt with methodical precision. The young woman glanced up, reading something in Margaret's expression that prompted her to ask, "Everything all right?" "Just clarifying perspectives," Margaret replied, settling beside her. Mr. Thornton was kind, enough to remind me what likely awaits in Clearwater. Emma's hand stilled on her weapon. You don't have to do this, she said quietly. We could still turn back. Margaret smiled, genuinely touched by the concern. 20 years is long enough to run from one's past, my dear. Whatever happens in Clearwater, it's time to face it properly. Later, that night during her watch, Margaret sat wrapped in a blanket against the autumn chill, her Winchester across her knees as she scanned the darkness surrounding their camp. The captive outlaws slept or pretended to, their forms indistinct bundles against the dying embers of the fire. In these quiet hours, with nothing but the night sounds and her own thoughts for company, Margaret found her mind returning to a critical question. Not what awaited her in Clearwater, but what had truly motivated her decision to embark on this journey at all. Was it, as she had told Emma, a desire to finally confront her past openly? Or was it something more complex, a recognition that her carefully constructed life as Margaret Fletcher had reached its natural conclusion the moment the Thornton gang discovered her true identity? Perhaps most troubling was the possibility that she had orchestrated this entire situation as a form of atonement, using the Thornton gang's capture and delivery to justice as a symbolic counterweight to her own unaddressed crimes. If so, was there any integrity in such a gesture, or merely another self-serving calculation? The night offered no clear answers, only the weight of accumulated choices and their consequences. As the stars wheeled overhead, Margaret Quicksilver Morgan maintained her vigil, a living legend contemplating the final chapter of her remarkable story. Dawn broke with a clarity that suggested fair weather for their final day of travel. Jensen relieved Margaret from her watch shortly before sunrise, allowing her a brief rest before they broke camp and continued their journey. "Anything?" he asked, as he took position at the camp's edge. "Nothing concrete," Margaret replied, "but we're being watched." Jensen's expression sharpened. "Where?" "Ridge to the north, about halfway up. Caught the reflection of glass around midnight, probably a spyglass. Whoever it was stayed put, just observing." This exchange, conducted in voices too low for the others to hear, revealed a level of coordination between Margaret and Jensen that went beyond their apparent roles. During their outlaw years, they had developed a shorthand communication that allowed them to share critical information while maintaining the appearance of casual conversation. "Friends of the Wallaces," Jensen suggested. Margaret considered the possibility. "Perhaps. Or someone from Blackwater who recognized our guests. Either way, we should expect company before Clearwater." As she predicted, they encountered their observers mid-morning at a point where the trail narrowed between two rocky outcroppings. 3 riders blocked their path, while the sound of approaching hooves behind them confirmed Margaret's suspicion of a coordinated effort. "That's far enough," called the lead rider, a weathered man with a substantial beard and a scar bisecting his left eyebrow. "We'll take the Thornton boys from here." Margaret reined her horse to a stop, assessing the situation with the calm efficiency that had once made her the most successful outlaw leader in the territories. The 3 men ahead carried rifles positioned for immediate use. The approaching riders behind, likely 2 or 3 based on the sound, would box them in within moments. "Mitchell Davis," she identified the leader with a slight nod. "Still, running errands for whoever pays best, I see." The bearded man's eyes narrowed with surprise and suspicion. "Do I know you, ma'am? We met briefly in Silver Creek, 63, Margaret replied, her manner suggesting this was a casual encounter rather than a potential ambush. "You were riding with Ben Foster's crew then. I was using a different name." This casual reference to events, nearly 25 years in the past, created exactly the uncertainty Margaret had intended. Davis studied her more carefully, recognition slowly dawning in his expression. "Can't be," he muttered. "You're supposed to be dead." Margaret's smile held no warmth. "Many things that are supposed to be true aren't, Mr. Davis, including your assumption that you'll be taking anyone from my custody today." Jensen had positioned himself subtly to cover their rear, while Emma maintained her place near the Thornton brothers, her hand resting casually near her holstered Colt. The Wallace twins, sensing potential rescue, had straightened in their saddles, though their bound hands prevented any active participation. 6 against 2, Davis observed, nodding toward Margaret and Jensen while apparently discounting Emma as a threat. "Those odds favor us considerably, whoever you are." "The odds favored the Halston gang at Copper Junction too," Margaret replied mildly. "All 6 of them against the little old me. Not one lived to regret that miscalculation." The casual reference To another legendary exploit from Quicksilver Maggie's past had its intended effect. Davis's expression shifted from confidence to uncertainty as he reassessed the elderly woman before him. "You claiming to be Quicksilver Maggie?" he asked, skepticism warring with a growing unease. "Prove it." Margaret's response was a movement so fluid and swift it seemed almost magical. The Winchester that had been secured to her saddle appeared in her hands. The barrel trained unerringly on Davis's chest. The speed of the draw lived up to her legendary nickname, creating a moment of stunned silence among Davis's men. "Convinced?" Margaret inquired pleasantly, the weapon perfectly steady despite her apparent age. "Or shall I demonstrate further?" Davis raised his hands slightly, his expression now showing genuine alarm. "If you're really her, then you know I'm just doing a job. No need for things to get messy." "Precisely my thinking," Margaret agreed, "which is why you and your friends will now discard your weapons and join our little procession to Clearwater. Marshal Thompson can sort out everyone's legal status upon our arrival." For a tense moment, it seemed Davis might resist. Then, with a barely perceptible nod to his companions, he slowly set his rifle on the ground. "Ease down, boys," he instructed. "This lady's reputation suggests we'd be wise to cooperate." As Davis's men reluctantly disarmed, Jasper Thornton watched the proceedings with a mixture of surprise and reluctant admiration. The woman he had dismissed as a relic of a bygone era had just neutralized a rescue attempt through nothing more than reputation and nerve. "Impressive performance," he commented, as Margaret secured their new prisoners with rope from her saddlebags. "Though I notice you didn't actually have to prove you could still shoot." Margaret glanced at him, amusement flickering briefly in her eyes. "A fundamental principle of negotiation, Mr. Thornton. Never demonstrate what your opponent already fears might be true." With Davis and his men disarmed and secured, their party now swelled to 10 riders, making their way toward Clearwater. Margaret maintained a vigilant watch, aware that this attempt might not be the last before they reached their destination. Emma rode alongside her as they navigated a particularly steep section of trail. "You knew they were coming," she observed. "You expected this exact scenario." "Not exact," Margaret corrected, "but something like it was probable. Men like the Thorntons don't operate without allies and associates. Someone was bound to attempt a rescue, and you counted on your reputation to avoid bloodshed," Emma concluded. Margaret nodded. Reputation is a powerful weapon when properly deployed, sometimes more effective than actual violence. This philosophy had been central to Margaret's success, both as an outlaw leader and in her subsequent years of retirement. The legend of Quicksilver Maggie, carefully cultivated through selective operations, strategic information release, and occasional theatrical flourishes, had often accomplished what guns alone could not. Now, in what might be the final chapter of that legend, Margaret was employing the same principles that had served her throughout her remarkable life. Whether they would prove sufficient to navigate the complexities awaiting in Clearwater remained to be seen, but for the moment they rode forward with a hard-won advantage against those who would disrupt their journey to justice. The afternoon. Sun cast long shadows across the trail as Margaret's expanded procession approached the outskirts of Clearwater. The town had grown considerably since her last visit nearly 2 decades earlier, when it had been little more than a trading post and a handful of rough buildings. Now it boasted a proper main street lined with businesses, a church steeple visible above the rooftops, and the unmistakable sign of frontier prosperity, a 2-story hotel with actual glass windows. Margaret studied the approaching settlement with the calculating eye of someone who had once specialized in evaluating towns for both opportunity and risk. The location of the marshal's office, the width of the streets, the number of potential witnesses, all factors that had once determined the success or failure of Quicksilver Maggie's operations. Now these same observations would shape her approach to surrendering the Thornton gang while potentially revealing her own identity. "Clearwater's grown," Jensen commented, pulling his horse alongside hers. "Indeed," Margaret agreed. "Civilization marches on, for better or worse." "Marshal Thompson's been here about 5 years," Jensen added, having gathered this intelligence during his blacksmithing business in the nearby settlement. "Former Army captain, reputation for being strict but fair." This information, casually delivered, represented another aspect of their long partnership. While Margaret had maintained her isolation in Whisper Valley, Jensen had served as her connection to the wider world, gathering news and assessing potential threats during his regular commerce with surrounding communities. Emma rode on Margaret's other side, her expression revealing a mixture of determination and apprehension. For her, this journey represented more than the delivery of prisoners. It marked her first significant venture beyond the confines of Whisper Valley since finding sanctuary with Margaret 2 years earlier. "Stay close to me when we enter town," Margaret instructed her. "There will be curious eyes and questions. Say nothing about my past or identity unless circumstances force the issue." Jasper Thornton, riding ahead of them with his hands bound to the saddle horn, turned slightly at this exchange. "Having second thoughts about your grand gesture, Mrs. Fletcher? Not too late to reconsider our arrangement." Margaret met his gaze evenly. "The arrangement stands, Mr. Thornton. I simply prefer to control how and when certain information is revealed." This preference for controlling narrative had been characteristic of Margaret throughout her outlaw career. Unlike many criminals, who either avoided publicity entirely or reveled in notorious fame, Quicksilver Maggie had cultivated a very specific legend, one that emphasized her intelligence, precision, and selective targeting rather than random violence. This carefully managed reputation had served both practical purposes, deterring rival gangs and amateur bounty hunters, and satisfied Margaret's sense that her criminal activities differed fundamentally from ordinary banditry. Now, approaching Clearwater with 10 prisoners in tow, she faced perhaps her most significant narrative challenge: how to present the capture of the Thornton gang without immediately revealing her own identity and criminal history. As they reached the town limits, their unusual procession immediately attracted attention. Shopkeepers stepped onto boardwalks, conversations halted mid-sentence, and children paused in their play to stare at the elderly woman leading a string of bound men through their streets. "Marshal's office is at the end of the main street," Jensen observed, nodding toward a substantial wooden building flying the territorial flag. "Looks like the news of our arrival is preceding us." Indeed, a small crowd had begun to gather, drawn by the spectacle of what appeared to be a major prisoner delivery. Margaret maintained her composed demeanor, neither hurrying nor slowing their steady progress toward the marshal's office. A broad-shouldered man wearing a marshal's badge emerged onto the building's porch, alerted by the commotion in the street. Marshal Robert Thompson stood with the straight-backed posture of his military background, his weathered face registering first surprise and then professional interest as he assessed the approaching group. "Quite a collection you're bringing in, ma'am," he called as they halted before his office. His gaze moved methodically across the prisoners, recognition dawning as he identified the Thornton brothers. Those wouldn't happen to be the Thorntons, would they? Margaret dismounted, with a grace that belied her apparent age, though she deliberately maintained some of the careful movements of an elderly woman. "Indeed they are, Marshal, along with their associates and some unexpected additions, who thought to relieve us of our charges along the way." Thompson's eyebrows rose appreciably. "You captured the Thornton gang? You and—" He glanced at Jensen and Emma, clearly trying to reconcile the unlikely group before him with the dangerous outlaws they had apparently subdued. "Circumstances favored us," Margaret replied modestly. "Though I should mention that the young man with the wounded arm, Patrick Ryan, provided assistance and deserves consideration regarding his case." This unexpected advocacy for Lucky drew surprised glances from both the young outlaw and Jasper Thornton. Margaret had made no previous indication that she would speak on Lucky's behalf. Marshal Thompson signaled to two deputies who had emerged behind him. "Davis, Harrison, secure these men in the cells. We'll sort out details once they're properly contained." As the deputies moved to carry out his orders, Thompson's attention returned to Margaret. "Ma'am, I'm going to need a complete statement about how you came to capture these men. The Thornton gang has been terrorizing 3 territories for months. There's substantial reward money involved." "I'd be happy to provide a statement," Margaret agreed, "though I suggest we handle the matter privately in your office. There are complexities to the situation that warrant discretion." Something in her tone and bearing registered with Thompson, the subtle authority of someone accustomed to command, so at odds with her appearance as an elderly frontier widow. His eyes narrowed slightly, reassessing her with greater attention. "Of course," he agreed after a moment. "Once the prisoners are secured." The process of transferring 9 men from horseback to the marshal's cells took considerable time, complicated by Wesley Thornton's attempt to break free during the transition. The effort earned him nothing but a painful takedown by one of the deputies and additional restraints once inside the jail. Throughout the procedure, Margaret maintained her position on the marshal's porch, observing without comment as her former captives were placed under official custody. Emma remained close by her side, while Jensen supervised the handling of their horses and equipment. As the last prisoner disappeared into the jailhouse, Marshal Thompson approached Margaret with renewed focus. "Now then, Mrs. Fletcher," Margaret supplied. "Margaret Fletcher. This is my ward, Emma Wilson, and my associate, Abel Jensen." Thompson nodded acknowledgement to each, before gesturing toward his office door. "If you'd join me inside, Mrs. Fletcher, your companions are welcome to avail themselves of the hotel across the street while we discuss the particulars of this situation." Margaret exchanged a glance with Jensen, a silent communication born of decades of partnership. He nodded almost imperceptibly, understanding that this conversation needed to happen without witnesses, even trusted ones. "Emma, go with Abel," Margaret instructed. "Get rooms for the night and see to the horses. I'll join you when I've completed my statement for the marshal." Emma hesitated, clearly reluctant to leave Margaret alone at this critical juncture. "Are you certain? I could wait. I'm quite capable of handling a conversation with the marshal," Margaret assured her with a faint smile. "This isn't my first official interview." The subtle reference to her outlaw past was lost on Thompson, but registered clearly with Emma, who finally nodded and joined Jensen as he headed toward the hotel. Inside the marshal's office, Thompson closed the door and gestured Margaret to a chair before settling behind his desk. The room was meticulously organized, reflecting the man's military background, files arranged in precise stacks, weapons clean and properly stored, maps of the territory pinned neatly to the walls. "Now then, Mrs. Fletcher," Thompson began, pulling a sheet of paper toward him and dipping his pen in ink. "I'd appreciate a full accounting of how an elderly widow and her companions managed to capture the most dangerous gang in the territory." Margaret settled comfortably in her chair, considering her approach carefully. The moment of truth, or at least partial truth, had arrived. How much to reveal, and in what manner, would determine not just her own fate, but potentially that of Emma and Jensen as well. "Marshal Thompson," she began, "what I'm about to tell you requires both an open mind and considerable discretion. The story behind the Thornton gang's capture involves elements of my personal history that I've kept private for many years. Thompson set down his pen, his expression shifting from administrative routine to focused interest. "I'm listening, ma'am." "The Thornton gang didn't select my homestead at random," Margaret explained. "They came specifically searching for something they believed I possessed, gold from a robbery committed over 20 years ago." The marshal's eyebrows rose slightly. "And did you possess this gold, Mrs. Fletcher?" "In a manner of speaking," Margaret acknowledged, though not in the way they imagined. With measured precision, she began relating a carefully edited version of events, how the Thorntons had arrived at her isolated homestead, their intentions obvious from the beginning, and the subsequent confrontation that had led to their capture. She described the journey to Clearwater and the attempted rescue by Mitchell Davis and his men, all without directly addressing the central question of her own identity. Thompson listened without interruption, his expression increasingly skeptical as the account progressed. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair, studying her with renewed intensity. "Mrs. Fletcher, you've provided an interesting account of what happened, but not why it happened. You mentioned gold from an old robbery that drew their attention, yet you've neatly avoided explaining your connection to that gold." His tone remained professional, but had taken on an edge of authority. "I think it's time for complete honesty. Who are you really?" The moment stretched between them, heavy with implication. Margaret had anticipated this direct confrontation, but found herself hesitating nonetheless. 20 years of careful anonymity stood balanced against the inevitability of revelation. "You're a student of territorial history, I assume, Marshal?" she asked, shifting approach slightly. "Particularly its criminal aspects given your position." Thompson nodded cautiously. "I make it my business to know the history of law and lawlessness in these parts." "Then the name Quicksilver Maggie Morgan might be familiar to you." The effect of the name was immediate. Thompson's posture stiffened, his expression registering shock followed quickly by disbelief. "Quicksilver Maggie died in a Pinkerton raid in Cheyenne, 1864. It's well-documented history. History is written by those who tell the loudest story, Marshal," Margaret replied, echoing words she had spoken to Jasper Thornton days earlier. "The Pinkertons preferred the tale of my death to the embarrassment of my escape." Thompson studied her with open skepticism. "You expect me to believe that you, an elderly widow living quietly in some remote valley, are actually the most notorious female outlaw in territorial history?" "I don't expect you to believe anything without evidence," Margaret countered calmly. She reached slowly into her jacket, careful to telegraph her movements to avoid alarming the lawman. From an inside pocket, she withdrew a small leather pouch and placed it on the desk between them. "Open it," she invited. Thompson hesitated, then untied the pouch and emptied its contents onto his desk. 3 items fell out. A gold coin bearing the distinctive 1857 mint mark from the Vermilion Creek robbery, a yellowed newspaper clipping reporting Quicksilver Maggie's supposed death, and most significantly, a small silver pendant shaped like a crescent moon, the personal token Maggie Morgan had reportedly left at each of her major robberies. A calling card that had never been publicly described in detail, but was known to law enforcement. The marshal picked up the pendant, turning it over to reveal the tiny engraved initials on the back. His expression shifted from skepticism to wary. "Belief. This proves nothing conclusively," he said, though his tone lacked conviction. "These items could have been acquired by various means." "Of course," Margaret agreed reasonably. "Though I could also describe in precise detail the layout of the first territorial bank in Helena before its renovation in '62, or the exact method by which the Quicksilver gang bypassed the specialized locks on the Copper Junction payroll office, or perhaps the words exchanged between Maggie Morgan and Pinkerton agent William Forrester during their brief encounter in Denver, an exchange no newspaper ever reported." Each example struck with increasing impact, details that only someone, intimately involved in those events, could possibly know. Thompson's expression continued its evolution from disbelief to stunned acceptance. "My God," he breathed finally. "You really are her." "I was her," Margaret corrected gently. "For the past 20 years, I've been exactly who I appear to be. Margaret Fletcher, widow and farmer, living quietly and harming no one." Thompson's professional training reasserted itself as he processed this extraordinary revelation. "You do understand that if you are indeed Quicksilver Maggie Morgan, you're confessing to dozens of federal crimes. Statutes of limitation don't apply to robberies of that magnitude." "I'm fully aware of the legal implications," Margaret confirmed, "which is why I've carefully weighed this decision before coming to Clearwater." "But why now?" Thompson asked, genuine puzzlement in his expression. "After 20 years of success, retirement, why risk everything to bring in the Thornton gang?" It was the same question Margaret had asked herself throughout their journey, one whose answer had evolved with each passing mile. The simplest explanation was practical necessity. Once the Thorntons discovered her identity, her peaceful existence in Whisper Valley was compromised regardless of how she handled them. Better to control the revelation than have it forced upon her. But beneath that pragmatic assessment lay deeper currents, the weight of unresolved guilt, the desire for a reckoning that might balance her moral ledger, perhaps even the recognition that her current life had reached its natural conclusion. "Several reasons," she acknowledged, "some practical, some perhaps more philosophical, but primarily because the Thorntons represent everything I deliberately avoided during my own outlaw years. Unnecessary cruelty, violence against the defenseless, destruction for its own sake." She met Thompson's gaze directly. Whatever else Quicksilver Maggie was, she operated by a code. These men have none. Thompson considered this, his expression thoughtful. A criminal with principles, delivering worse criminals to justice. There's irony there. "Life is seldom without irony, Marshal," Margaret observed with a faint smile. A silence settled between them as Thompson absorbed the implications of this extraordinary situation. Finally, he straightened in his chair, his expression returning to professional detachment. "Mrs. Fletcher, or Miss Morgan, I suppose, while I appreciate your forthrightness and the service you've rendered in capturing the Thornton gang, I can't simply ignore your confession to multiple federal crimes." His tone carried regret but firmness. "I'll need to detain you pending communication with territorial authorities." Margaret nodded, having anticipated this outcome. "I understand completely, Marshal. I would ask only 2 considerations. First, that my companions not be implicated in my past activities, as they had no knowledge or involvement. And second, that you consider my testimony regarding young Patrick Ryan's limited participation in the Thornton gang's crimes." Thompson studied her with newfound respect. "Your companions will not be detained based solely on association, though I'll need their statements. As for Ryan, his cooperation and your testimony will certainly be factors in how his case is handled." He hesitated before adding, "I must say this is not how I expected my day to unfold." "Few days turn out precisely as expected in my experience," Margaret replied, with the wisdom of her remarkable life journey. "It's what makes them worth living." As Marshal Thompson summoned his deputy to process her detention, Margaret felt a curious lightness despite the handcuffs being placed on her wrists. 20 years of looking over her shoulder, of maintaining a facade while hiding her true self, had ended. Whatever came next, trial, imprisonment, perhaps even the gallows, would be faced directly, without pretense or evasion. For a woman who had spent much of her life crafting careful illusions and strategic misdirections, there was an unexpected freedom in finally standing revealed, all masks set aside. As she was led to the cells, walking with the straight-back dignity that had once made her the most formidable outlaw leader in the territory, Margaret Quicksilver Morgan felt something she had not experienced in decades, the peculiar peace that comes from embracing one's complete truth, whatever the consequences. Word of Margaret's true identity spread through Clearwater like wildfire. By morning, the town had transformed from a quiet frontier settlement into a circus of curiosity seekers, journalists, and opportunists, hoping to catch a glimpse of the legendary Quicksilver Maggie. The modest jailhouse found itself the center of unprecedented attention, with crowds gathering outside, despite Marshal Thompson's stern warnings to disperse. Inside her cell, Margaret sat calmly on the narrow cot, her posture straight and her gaze steady as she observed the morning light. Filtering through the barred window, the heavy iron door separating the cell block from the marshal's office muffled, but couldn't entirely block the growing commotion outside. The previous night's peace, that curious lightness she'd felt upon finally embracing her true identity, remained, with her lending a serene quality to her demeanor despite her circumstances. Emma arrived shortly after dawn, her eyes red-rimmed from what had clearly been a sleepless night. Marshal Thompson, recognizing the young woman's distress, allowed her a brief visit while maintaining discreet supervision from his desk. "I've sent word to Lawyer Hollister in Blackwater," Emma reported in a hushed voice, gripping the cell bars as if they were the only thing keeping her upright. "Jensen rode out at first light. Hollister has experience with territorial courts. He might be able to negotiate terms, considering your assistance with the Thornton gang." Margaret nodded appreciation, though her expression suggested limited faith in legal solutions. "A thoughtful effort, though I caution against excessive optimism. The crimes attributed to Quicksilver Maggie carry substantial penalties regardless of how many years have passed." "But 20 years of peaceful living must count for something," Emma insisted, the desperation in her voice revealing how deeply she'd been affected by Margaret's arrest. "You've helped countless people in Whisper Valley. You captured the most dangerous outlaws in the territory. Surely that merits consideration." "Perhaps," Margaret allowed, "though justice rarely operates on balanced scales in these matters." From across the cell block, Jasper Thornton's sardonic laugh interrupted their conversation. "Listen to the girl, Quicksilver. She still believes in fairy tales where good deeds erase past sins." He approached his cell door, studying Margaret, with a mixture of resentment and reluctant respect. "We're cut from the same cloth, you and I. The territory's just been waiting longer to hang you." "We share certain experiences, Mr. Thornton," Margaret corrected calmly, "but little else. There's a considerable difference between outlawry with principle and brutality without purpose." This philosophical distinction, one Margaret had maintained throughout her extraordinary life journey, clearly irritated Jasper. "Principles?" he spat. "You stole the same as us. You shot men the same as us. The rest are just pretty stories." "You tell yourself to sleep at night." Before Margaret could respond, Marshal Thompson appeared at the cell block entrance. "That's enough, Thornton," he warned before turning to Emma. "I'm afraid visiting time's over, Miss Wilson. The territorial circuit judge has been notified and is expected within the week. Until then, Mrs. Morgan remains in custody." Emma reluctantly took her leave, promising to return with Jensen once Lawyer Hollister arrived from Blackwater. As the young woman departed, Margaret noted the straight-backed determination that had replaced her initial shock, a strength and resilience she had worked to cultivate during their time together in Whisper Valley. The day progressed with a steady stream of official visitors. First came the town mayor, a pompous man clearly eager to associate himself with the capture of both the Thornton gang and the legendary Quicksilver Maggie. His transparent self-importance amused Margaret, who recognized the familiar pattern of men seeking to claim credit for events in which they'd played no part. By afternoon, a Pinkerton agent had arrived via the eastbound stage, a distinguished gentleman with silver hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. William Forrester had spent most of his career pursuing the Quicksilver Gang before the Cheyenne ambush supposedly ended Maggie Morgan's criminal career. Now, 20 years later, he stood before Margaret's cell with an expression combining professional satisfaction and personal fascination. "You've aged well, Miss Morgan," he observed after Marshal Thompson had granted them privacy. "Though I suppose peaceful living agrees with most of us better than a life on the run." Margaret studied him with the measured assessment that had once made her the most successful outlaw leader in the territories. "As have you, Agent Forrester. The silver becomes you." This acknowledgement of their shared history, adversaries who had spent years in a complex dance of pursuit and evasion, created a curious dynamic between them. Unlike the townsfolk hungry for sensational tales or the officials focused solely on punishment, Forrester approached Margaret with the respect one professional might accord another, regardless of which side of the law they had operated on. "I spent 3 years tracking you after Vermilion Creek," he remarked, settling onto the chair Thompson had provided. "Studied every operation, interviewed every witness, analyzed every detail we could gather. You were extraordinary, unlike any outlaw I encountered in 30 years with the agency." "High praise from the man who nearly caught me in Denver," Margaret replied, a hint of her old humor briefly lightening her expression. Forrester's eyebrows rose in mild surprise. "You recognized me that day at the Brown Palace?" "Immediately," Margaret confirmed. "Just as you recognized me, despite my rather convincing disguise as Catherine Walsh, a Boston widow visiting her sister." "The disguise was impeccable," Forrester acknowledged. "But something in your eyes, a particular awareness of everyone in the room, every exit, every potential threat, not something easily concealed, even by someone of your considerable talents." Their conversation continued with this peculiar blend of professional assessment and personal reminiscence, two aging adversaries finding unexpected common ground in their shared history. Forrester revealed that he had maintained the Quicksilver Gang files long after the Pinkertons officially closed the case, his professional instincts never fully accepting the reports of Maggie Morgan's death in Cheyenne. As their meeting concluded, Forrester offered an unexpected observation. "You know, Miss Morgan, there's considerable discrepancy between operations attributed to the Quicksilver Gang before and after Cheyenne. Different methodologies, different target selection, different levels of violence." Margaret's expression remained neutral, though her attention sharpened noticeably. "Is that so?" "Indeed," Forrester continued, "particularly the Carson City bank robbery in '65 that left 3 tellers dead. Nothing like your earlier operations, no advance intelligence gathering, no precise timing, excessive force where none was required. Almost as if someone else had adopted the Quicksilver name after your departure." This subtle suggestion that crimes committed under the Quicksilver name after Cheyenne might have been the work of imposters rather than Margaret herself planted a seed that would significantly influence subsequent events. Whether offered from professional integrity or some more personal motivation, Forrester's observation introduced a distinction few others had considered in the legendary outlaw's case. That evening, as Margaret prepared for her first night in Clearwater's jail, Marshal Thompson approached her cell with an unusual request. "The territorial governor's office has telegraphed," he explained, his expression suggesting he found the communication as surprising as Margaret might. "They've requested a comprehensive written account of your criminal activities, with particular attention to details never publicly disclosed. Apparently, your case has historical significance beyond its legal implications." Margaret received this request with the thoughtful consideration that characterized her approach to most situations. "An interesting development," she observed, "though I wonder if providing such documentation merely streamlines the prosecution's work." That's entirely possible, Thompson acknowledged candidly. Though I understand the Historical Archives Department has taken particular interest as well. The Quicksilver Gang represents a significant chapter in territorial development, regardless of its criminal nature. After brief deliberation, Margaret nodded agreement. I'll provide the account as requested, though I would ask for assurance that any information regarding associates who may have survived Cheyenne be treated with appropriate discretion. 20 years is sufficient time for people to build new lives worth preserving. This conditional acceptance, protecting others while accepting her own fate, exemplified the code Margaret had lived by throughout her extraordinary journey. Thompson seemed to recognize this, his expression reflecting newfound respect for the elderly woman whose legendary past had so recently been revealed. The following days established a routine of sorts. Each morning, Margaret worked on her written account, documenting the Quicksilver Gang's operations with the same meticulous attention to detail that had once made them so successful. Each afternoon, she received visitors, Emma and Jensen bringing updates on their legal efforts, Forrester continuing their professional discussions, occasionally other officials seeking information or simply satisfying curiosity about the notorious Outlaw. Throughout this period, Margaret maintained the composed dignity that had characterized her since their arrival in Clearwater. Unlike the Thornton brothers, who alternated between sullen silence and outbursts of frustration as their legal situation deteriorated, she approached her circumstances with philosophical acceptance, neither denying responsibility for her past actions nor displaying undue concern about potential consequences. 5 days after Margaret's arrest, the situation shifted dramatically with the arrival of Judge Harlan Blackwood, a severe, imposing figure whose reputation for harsh sentences had earned him the nickname Hanging Harlan throughout the territories. The Thornton brothers visibly paled at news of his arrival, while even Marshal Thompson seemed apprehensive about the judicial proceedings that would follow. Emma, returning from a meeting with lawyer Hollister, brought news that only intensified the gravity of Margaret's situation. The judge has scheduled a combined trial for both you and the Thornton gang, she reported, her expression betraying her anxiety. Hollister says it's unprecedented, completely different cases being handled together. Not entirely unprecedented, Margaret corrected gently, nor entirely illogical from the court's perspective. Both cases involve notorious outlaws, both require significant security arrangements, both have attracted unusual public attention. Combined proceedings serve practical purposes, though they may create certain contextual challenges. This measured assessment, recognizing potential complications without surrendering to despair, reflected Margaret's lifelong approach to difficult situations. Throughout her extraordinary journey from desperate outlaw to peaceful farmer, she had maintained this strategic clarity that allowed her to navigate challenges others found overwhelming. The trial commenced the following morning in Clearwater's town hall, hastily converted into a makeshift courtroom to accommodate the unprecedented proceedings. Judge Blackwood presided from a raised platform, his black robes and severe countenance lending an air of somber authority to the frontier justice being dispensed. Margaret entered the proceedings with the quiet dignity that had become her hallmark, her simple dark dress and silver hair creating a striking contrast to the rough appearance of the Thornton gang seated across the aisle. Lawyer Hollister, a nervous young man clearly intimidated by the high-profile nature of the case, arranged his notes with trembling hands as Prosecutor Aldridge prepared his opening statements with confident flourish. This court faces the extraordinary circumstance of addressing not one, but 2 infamous criminal enterprises, Aldridge began, his voice carrying easily through the packed chamber. The brutal Thornton gang, whose recent reign of terror has claimed countless innocent lives, and the legendary Quicksilver Gang, whose spectacular robberies 2 decades ago represented the most successful criminal operation in territorial history. This deliberate pairing, linking Margaret's past activities with the Thorntons' recent brutality, revealed the prosecution's strategy of contextual association rather than factual equivalence. Judge Blackwood's expression remained impassive as Aldridge outlined the extensive charges against both parties, though his occasional glance toward Margaret suggested particular interest in the historical dimension of her case. When Hollister rose for the defense's opening statement, his initial nervousness gave way to unexpected passion as he addressed the fundamental distinction the prosecution had deliberately obscured. "Your Honor," he began, his voice gaining strength with each word, "while this court understandably seeks efficiency through combined proceedings, we must not allow convenience to create false equivalence. The 23 charges against Mrs. Morgan relate to events that occurred more than 2 decades ago, events that, regardless of their legal classification, differed fundamentally from the wanton brutality attributed to the Thornton gang. This emphasis on temporal and methodological distinction represented their primary defense strategy, not denying Margaret's outlaw past, but establishing clear separation between her historical activities and the immediate violence that had brought the Thorntons before the court. As the trial progressed, this strategic approach gained unexpected support from a most unlikely source. William Forrester, called as an expert witness regarding the Quicksilver Gang's operations, provided testimony that systematically distinguished between authenticated Quicksilver activities prior to Cheyenne and subsequent crimes committed under that name. Based on comprehensive review of Pinkerton records, Forrester testified with the measured precision of a career investigator. Significant operational differences exist between verified Quicksilver Gang robberies from 1857 to 1864 and those attributed to the same organization after the Cheyenne incident. Most notably, the Carson City bank robbery of 1865, which resulted in 3 civilian deaths, demonstrates none of the tactical characteristics, intelligence gathering, or violence limitations consistently observed in operations personally led by Margaret Morgan. This expert assessment that crimes committed under the Quicksilver name after Cheyenne likely represented the work of imposters rather than Margaret herself created a critical distinction that even Judge Blackwood could not entirely dismiss. The legendary Quicksilver Maggie had committed numerous robberies, certainly, but the most violent acts attributed to her gang had apparently occurred after her transformation into Margaret Fletcher. When Margaret finally took the witness stand, on the trial's 3rd day, the courtroom fell into complete silence, spectators leaning forward to catch every word from the woman whose exploits had become frontier legend. Under Hollister's careful questioning, she provided a straightforward account of her extraordinary life journey, from privileged Boston upbringing to desperate outlaw, from legendary criminal to peaceful farmer. Her testimony neither denied responsibility for actual crimes, nor sought sympathy through elaborate justifications. Instead, she offered the historical context that transformed sensationalistic legend into comprehensible human experience. Each operation the original Quicksilver Gang had conducted under her leadership was acknowledged with factual precision, while she carefully distinguished these from subsequent crimes committed by others using the infamous name. The Quicksilver Gang ceased to exist after Cheyenne, she testified with quiet certainty. Those who survived that ambush scattered to various new lives, myself included. Any operations conducted under that name after August 1864 were the work of others, primarily, I believe, former Lieutenant David Carson, who had always resented the tactical restrictions I imposed regarding civilian casualties. This distinction between authenticated Quicksilver operations and subsequent imposters gained further credibility when Hollister introduced documented evidence of Margaret's presence in Whisper Valley during the period when several of the most violent Quicksilver robberies had occurred. Property records, tax filings, and business transactions established timelines that made her personal participation in these later crimes a physical impossibility. As the trial entered its final phase, an unexpected development further altered the proceedings' trajectory. Young Patrick Ryan, the newest and least hardened member of the Thornton gang, accepted the prosecution's offer of reduced charges in exchange for comprehensive testimony about the gang's operations, particularly the Peterson family massacre, that had cemented their reputation for excessive brutality. Ryan's testimony, delivered with evident remorse and frequent glances toward Margaret, created a devastating contrast between the Thornton gang's purposeless violence and the Quicksilver gang's more disciplined approach 20 years earlier. His description of Jasper Thornton's deliberate execution of women and children contradicted every operational principle Margaret had established during her outlaw career. Throughout Ryan's testimony, Margaret's expression remained composed, though those who knew her well could detect the subtle indicators of her internal response, the slight tightening around her eyes, the barely perceptible straightening of her already impeccable posture. For a woman who had maintained strict prohibitions against harming women and children throughout her criminal career, the Peterson massacre represented everything she had deliberately avoided, even at the height of her outlawry. As the trial concluded, its fifth day, Judge Blackwood made an unexpected announcement. Having reviewed the substantial evidence presented regarding the distinct nature of criminal activities attributed to the Quicksilver name before and after August 1864, this court finds sufficient cause to separate charges accordingly. His severe expression betrayed no emotion as he continued, "The defendant, Margaret Morgan, will face judgment solely for operations conclusively linked to her leadership, while charges related to subsequent activities will be held in abeyance, pending further investigation." This judicial acknowledgement that crimes committed under the Quicksilver name after Cheyenne would be treated separately from Margaret's authenticated activities represented a significant victory for their defense strategy. While she would still face considerable legal consequences for her actual crimes, the most violent acts attributed to the Quicksilver gang would no longer factor into her sentencing. The jury deliberated for nearly 7 hours before returning. With their verdict, as the foreman rose to announce their determination, Margaret sat with perfect composure, her back straight and her gaze steady, despite the gravity of the moment. On 14 counts of armed robbery, theft of federal property, and conspiracy against territorial authorities, we find the defendant, Margaret Morgan, guilty, the foreman announced, his voice carrying clearly through the silent chamber. On 9 counts relating to operations conducted after August 1864, we find insufficient evidence of the defendant's direct participation. This mixed verdict, acknowledging Margaret's leadership of the original Quicksilver gang while exonerating her from the most violent crimes committed under that name after Cheyenne, represented a nuanced response to the complex historical record. Hollister and Forrester had helped establish. Judge Blackwood received the jury's determination with judicial gravity before addressing Margaret directly. "The defendant will rise for sentencing." Margaret stood with characteristic dignity, her expression revealing neither fear nor expectation as she awaited the judge's pronouncement. "Margaret Morgan," Blackwood began, "this court has found you guilty of serious offenses against public order and lawful commerce, offenses that ordinarily would merit the maximum punishment available under territorial statutes." He paused, studying Margaret with an expression that suggested genuine consideration, rather than perfunctory judgment. "However, this court must also acknowledge the extraordinary circumstances of your case, particularly your 20 years of law-abiding citizenship since abandoning your criminal identity and your recent instrumental role in bringing the dangerous Thornton gang to justice." Throughout the courtroom, spectators leaned forward in anticipation, recognizing that hanging Harlan Blackwood might be preparing to deliver a sentence more nuanced than his fearsome reputation would suggest. Justice requires punishment, commensurate with proven crimes, the judge continued, yet wisdom suggests that punishment after 20 years of demonstrated rehabilitation serves limited social purpose beyond abstract retribution. This philosophical framing, distinguishing between justice's demand for consequences and wisdom's recognition of redemption, revealed unexpected depth to Blackwood's judicial perspective. His reputation for severity had obscured a more complex approach to the law's fundamental purpose. Therefore, this court sentences you to 8 years imprisonment, with eligibility for parole consideration after 2 years based on continued exemplary behavior and cooperation with authorities regarding historical documentation of frontier criminal activities. This sentence, significantly less than the maximum punishment for Margaret's acknowledged crimes, represented judicial recognition of her extraordinary life journey. While not the complete exoneration Emma had hoped for, it acknowledged both the reality of past crimes and the legitimacy of subsequent redemption. As Marshal Thompson prepared to escort Margaret from the courtroom, Emma pushed forward, tears streaming down her face despite her evident effort to maintain composure. 2 years, she whispered as she embraced her mentor. We'll have the farm waiting for you. Margaret returned the embrace with genuine affection. The time will pass quickly enough, she assured the young woman. Use it to build the life you deserve, the one we've prepared for together. Jensen approached next, his weathered face revealing complex emotions. I'll look after things, he promised simply, the brief statement encompassing their decades of shared history and mutual understanding. As Margaret was led from the courtroom to begin her sentence, an unexpected moment occurred. William Forrester stepped forward, offering a respectful nod that acknowledged the conclusion of their decades-long connection as hunter and quarry. An extraordinary ending to an extraordinary story, Mrs. Morgan, he observed quietly. Perhaps not an ending, Mr. Forrester, Margaret replied, with the faint smile that had once characterized Quicksilver Maggie in her prime. Merely the beginning of its final chapter. 3 years later, a stagecoach arrived in Whisper Valley, carrying a passenger whose arrival had been anticipated for weeks. Margaret Morgan, now 74, but still carrying herself with remarkable dignity, stepped down to find Emma waiting with a buggy to transport her home. The young woman had clearly thrived during Margaret's absence, her confident bearing and clear-eyed determination suggesting she had built upon the foundation Margaret had established while developing her own distinct identity. The farm had prospered under her management, with new outbuildings and expanded fields visible even from the valley entrance. "Welcome home," Emma said simply as they embraced, the words carrying weight beyond their apparent simplicity. As they travelled toward the farmhouse, Margaret observed the changes to the property with evident approval. "You've made improvements," she noted. "Applied what you taught me," Emma confirmed, "both about farming and about building something meant to last. This continuity, the passing of knowledge and values from one generation to the next, represented Margaret's most significant legacy, far outweighing the infamous reputation that had once defined her. The notorious Quicksilver Maggie had faded into history, while the wisdom and resilience of Margaret Morgan continued through her influence on a young woman who had found her own strength. Her 2 years of imprisonment had passed without incident, with Margaret's model behavior and extensive cooperation with historical documentation, leading to parole at the earliest opportunity Judge Blackwood had permitted. Her detailed accounts of frontier criminal activities had proven valuable to authorities developing more effective law enforcement strategies, while simultaneously preserving accurate historical records of a tumultuous period in territorial development. Upon Reaching the farmhouse, Margaret found several neighbours gathered to welcome her home, people who had known her as Margaret Fletcher for decades and whose support had continued despite the revelations about her past identity. Their presence testified to the genuine connections she had established during her years in Whisper Valley, relationships based on the person she had become rather than the legend she had once been. Jensen emerged from the barn, his massive frame, now showing the effects of advancing age, but his eyes still carrying the alert watchfulness that had made him such an effective lieutenant during their outlaw years. Their greeting required no extensive words, a simple nod and handshake conveying all that needed saying between people whose connection transcended ordinary expression. That evening, as twilight descended over Whisper Valley, Margaret sat on the farmhouse porch, observing the peaceful landscape she had chosen as sanctuary 2 decades earlier. Emma joined her, bringing coffee and settling into the adjacent chair with comfortable familiarity. "What happens now?" the young woman asked, the question encompassing far more than immediate plans. Margaret considered this thoughtfully, her gaze taking in the farm that represented her life's final chapter. "Now, we continue building something worthy of continuing," she replied. "Something based on truth rather than deception, on creation rather than acquisition." This philosophy, the culmination of her extraordinary journey from desperate outlaw to peaceful farmer, represented Margaret's hard-won wisdom. The legendary Quicksilver Maggie had pursued justice through redistribution of wealth, striking at corrupt institutions with tactical brilliance, but ultimately perpetuating cycles of violence and retribution. Margaret Fletcher had discovered a different path, creating value through honest labor, building community through genuine connection, finding redemption through accepting responsibility rather than avoiding consequences. "The Thornton brothers were hanged last month," Emma mentioned, the information offered without particular emotion. "Marshal Thompson sent word when it happened." Margaret nodded, receiving this news with the philosophical acceptance that had characterized her approach to justice throughout the legal proceedings. The Thornton gang had represented everything she had deliberately avoided during her outlaw years: unnecessary cruelty, indiscriminate violence, destruction without purpose. Their fate, while not cause for celebration, validated the distinction between different forms of law-breaking that her trial had ultimately acknowledged. As darkness settled over Whisper Valley, Margaret and Emma remained on the porch, their conversation turning to practical matters: crops to be planted, repairs to be completed, neighbors to be visited. This ordinary discussion of daily life represented Margaret's most complete victory, not escaping justice for past crimes, but establishing a life of genuine value that transcended her infamous history. The remarkable saga of Margaret Quicksilver. Morgan, from privileged daughter to desperate outlaw, from legendary criminal to peaceful farmer, from fugitive to accepted member of her community, represented a quintessentially American story of reinvention and redemption. Her journey through the tumultuous decades of frontier development had paralleled the nation's own evolution, from lawless territory to established society. Her personal transformation mirroring larger social progress toward justice, tempered by wisdom. As stars appeared above Whisper Valley, Margaret Morgan contemplated the final chapter of her extraordinary life, with the same strategic clarity that had once made her legendary. Having faced her past directly and accepted its consequences, she now embraced a future defined not by escape, but by purpose, continuing to build something worthy of outlasting her, a legacy of creation rather than acquisition, of wisdom rather than mere cunning. The notorious Quicksilver Maggie had finally completed her most masterful escape, not from justice, but from the limited identity that frontier legend had assigned her. In its place stood Margaret Morgan, a woman who had traversed the full spectrum of human experience and emerged with hard-won insight about what truly constituted a life well lived. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.